Welcome to the repackaged version of the Lord of the Rings: The Card Game Retrospective, the greatest modern card game. If you're new here, I'm Jackson Moorfield, and I invite you to kick back and enjoy almost 4 hours of content dedicated to one of the greatest games ever made. And if you're returning, please don't be jarred by the spots where I had to do some voice dubbing to avoid copyright infringement. Either way, hope you enjoy this, and see you in the next video.
An ancient evil stirs in the black lands of Mordor, and the people of Middle-earth speak of a terrible doom approaching from the east. The Dark Lord Sauron is gathering his forces, and should he acquire the power he seeks, he will cast the world into eternal shadow. The only hope lies in a heroic few who must work together to stem the tide of evil.
When I first decided I wanted to make a retrospective video on the Lord of the Rings: The Card Game, I initially envisioned the video as a leisurely walk through the history of the game. But I realized as we approach Top 100 Board Games of All Time season for the board game YouTuber community that I have something a little bit more interesting to offer all of you. The Lord of the Rings: The Card Game is the greatest modern card game. That's right. The fact that the Lord of the Rings: The Card Game is the greatest modern card game comes down to 3 factors. 1, the way it executes on cooperative play. 2, the way the game integrates with the theme of the Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth at large. And 3, with the card pool itself when it comes to your deck construction option. We're going to talk about all 3 of these arguments in this video series. Yeah, that's right. This retrospective is going to first be released as a video series. And we will get that walk through the history of the game when we talk about the card pool. What better time to be talking about the prowess of the Lord of the Rings: The Card Game than now? I'm recording this in December of 2024. Like the theatrical version of Return of the King, the Lord of the Rings: The Card Game has more than one ending because we are at the end of the cycle of repackaged expansions for the game. We're at the precipice of ending number 2, which in the movie would be the throwing of the ring into Mount Doom. But before we diminish and go into the west, let's take one more journey on some direction along the Anduin and start with the setting of the Lord of the Rings: The Card Game, Middle-earth.
I was there, Gandalf. I was there 3,000 years ago.
The origins of the Lord of the Rings: The Card Game trace back to the early 2010s, when Fantasy Flight Games was already known for its rich thematic games. The designer, Nate French, sought to create a game that was not only faithful to the source material, but also something that could be played solo or cooperatively, which is a significant departure from the competitive nature of most card games at the time. Now, the Lord of the Rings: The Card Game was not the first Lord of the Rings card game, much less the first Lord of the Rings tabletop game. Far from it. There are many Lord of the Rings themed tabletop games of note. When it comes to card games, you had the Middle-earth collectible card game, which ran from 1995 to 1998. Now, this game was released around the same time you saw Magic the Gathering and the Pokemon trading card game dominating the tabletop scene, well before the golden age of board gaming, for which most of the Lord of the Rings: The Card Game's life has taken place in. The Middle-earth collectible card game also can take credit for kickstarting the Lure of Middle-earth convention over in Germany. That card game only lasted 3 years and was not nearly as popular as other games that were released after the Peter Jackson movie trilogy from 2001 to 2003. Another Lord of the Rings card game was the Lord of the Rings trading card game. This game was active from 2001 to 2007. This game is notable to me because when I first received the game as a gift from my wife, she also threw in a booster pack for this game. So there wasn't much I could do with it, but she thought it was part of the game, which is totally understandable. There weren't a lot of choices back then. When it comes to board games, October of 2000 saw Reiner Knizia's The Lord of the Rings. Came out a year before the Lord of the Rings trilogy hit theaters, and to be honest, at the time, it didn't seem as poorly titled as it is now. The fact that expansions drop the is a bit of a blemish on the game's history. Speaking of dropping the, Cosmos produced Lord of the Rings The Duel in 2002. Two versions of Lord of the Rings Risk were released concurrently with the movie trilogy. You had the Lord of the Rings Risk and Lord of the Rings Risk Trilogy Edition, the Trilogy Edition being the better of the two. Games Workshop would release the first version of their studio-saving Middle-earth strategy battle game in 2001. In 2002, Reiner Knizia was again making Lord of the Rings games, when he made the first version of the Stratego killer, The Lord of the Rings The Confrontation. That game would end up getting a new edition a few years later, and is still today one of the best replacements for any Stratego-style two-player game. The often overlooked Middle-earth Quest was released by Fantasy Flight Games in 2009. Remember, Fantasy Flight is the studio that produces the Lord of the Rings the card game. The first and second editions of War of the Ring were released in 2004 and 2011, respectively. The latter of which, the second edition, is rated by many as one of the best board games ever made. It is one of the few risers on the Board Game Geek Top 100, and despite a handful of expansions, still operates as a great 2 or 4 player epic gaming experience. It's safe to say that Fantasy Flight Games was not breaking completely new ground by releasing a Lord of the Rings game in 2011, as it did with the Lord of the Rings the card game. But what was groundbreaking was the design. Nate French, the initial designer of the game, put together a system that would eventually provide the mining equipment for delving more deeply and more greedily into Middle-earth than any game had ever gone before on the tabletop. Mining on the tabletop. In a recent interview with Nerd of the Rings, Lord of the Rings the card game chief designer Caleb Grace, who took over for Nate French early on in the game's life, talked about how in his office in the Fantasy Flight Studios, you'd have a map of Middle-earth, and that it was used for inspiration for where to go with various expansions to the game, and it certainly shows. You see, unlike many of the tabletop implementations of Lord of the Rings games, the Lord of the Rings card game did not start in the setting of the movie or the titular book. Titular? Of the titular book. I've never said that word before. It sounds a little bit weird coming out. The missions of the core set take place in Mirkwood, which is an area that was somewhat explored in The Hobbit, but goes almost unmentioned in most Lord of the Rings games. And from there, it would only get better. You see, many Lord of the Rings board games have the issue of playing out the events of the book and the movie. The ones that everyone is very familiar with. Everyone knows what happens during the course of Lord of the Rings. Spoiler alert, the forces of men and the West at large hold out long enough so that Frodo and Sam and Gollum can destroy the ring. So most board games that take place in this setting have you reliving those events to some degree. Now this could be good and bad. If you want to relive the movie, that can be fun. However, there's not going to be a lot of drama to that. Truly relive the movie, the same things are going to happen. You already know the beats of the story, unless you've never actually seen the movie before, in which case you're probably not even bothering to buy a Lord of the Rings game. So what most games do is they provide a bit of a twist. For example, in War of the Ring, one player takes over the forces of good and the Fellowship, and the other player takes on the role of Sauron, controlling the forces of Mordor, and Isengard and the forces of evil. The Fellowship player could send the Fellowship on a completely different route than the Fellowship actually transversed in the movie, and that could be a very interesting story. Or you could follow the path as it goes, and that seems like a fine enough option for some people, but for people like me, I'm frustrated sometimes having to go back and forth between, am I in the movie or am I doing something completely different? If I fail as the Fellowship player, that's just kind of sucks, because part of why I like the movie is because of what happens in it. And just rewatching the movie on the tabletop and this time it doesn't work out, it's just more disappointing than losing a board game needs to be, in my opinion. And yeah, you can win in different ways, but you're now not following the movie anymore. If you win by bringing your Fellowship, for example, through along the western coast of Middle-earth, and you avoid Moria entirely, and Gandalf's still with you at the end of the game, you might win, but it feels like a bastardization of the story to an extent. So you're in a lose-lose situation with a lot of Lord of the Rings themed board games. This either have to give you agency or give you immersion, or give you some mix of both that's very hard to balance. What the Lord of the Rings the card game does, gives you immersion by putting you into the world of Middle-earth, but it doesn't always send you on the same story. It does have expansions where you take on the Lord of the Rings story, but most of the game is not at all along with the story. So the major expansion cycles of the game took you from Mirkwood throughout Middle-earth, and it went a little bit like this. In the first cycle of the Lord of the Rings the card game, which includes the core set and the Shadows of Mirkwood expansion cycle, you begin in the south of Mirkwood, near Dol Guldur. You move towards the Carrock, where Beorn hangs out in The Hobbit, and then you also move back south a little bit through Mirkwood. While these settings will evoke The Hobbit and the Hunt for Gollum storyline that is going to actually be made into its own movie, it doesn't follow so tightly to the Lord of the Rings books that you feel like you have to succeed, otherwise you have doomed not only this individual game you're playing, but you have doomed the fate of Middle-earth. The second cycle of the game, Khazad-dûm and the Dwarven cycle, you move into Moria. This cycle thematically puts you in Moria, leaving Moria and then facing Durin's Bane, which was unfortunate because around the same time the Saga expansions to the Lord of the Rings were released, where you did actually go in and fight Durin's Bane like the Fellowship did in the Fellowship of the Ring. In the matter of like a year or two, you ended up facing Durin's Bane in some form 3 times. That was a little bit repetitive. But the third cycle of the game is when things start to get a little bit more interesting. With Heirs of Numenor and the Against the Shadow cycle, you were questing in and around Gondor. And then in the fourth cycle of the game, the Voice of Isengard and the Ringmaker cycle, you're moving in and around Isengard, Rohan, and Dunland. While these areas were featured within the Lord of the Rings, your actions are much more divergent. For example, you're not replaying the Battle of Pelennor Fields or the Battle of Helm's Deep. The fifth cycle of game is when things really started to take off. With the Lost Realm and the Angmar Awakened cycle, you began to explore the realm of Arnor, which has an actual fairly interesting history to it, but has never been on the big screen. In the sixth cycle of the game, you have the Grey Havens and the Dream Chaser cycle. This is where you move west to Lindon and the Grey Havens, and you actually go onto the ocean, which is very different than anything that happens in the books. You eventually land in Harad, with the Sands of Harad and the Haradrim cycle, moving then north to the Wilds of Rovanion in the Arid Mithrin cycle, and finishing up with A Shadow in the East and the Vengeance of Mordor cycle, taking place in the Land of Ruin. So the Lord of the Rings card game succeeds in allowing you to play the game without needing to tightly follow the story or feel like you're obligated in any way to follow the story of the Lord of the Rings to be successful. But there's another way that the Lord of the Rings card game is able to fully capitalize on the lore of Middle-earth, and it's in the fact that it's a card game. You see, when you have an expandable card game, you need to have a lot of cards. To have a rich experience, especially in deck construction, you need to have a lot. There aren't going to be enough characters in the main events of the story anyway. So when the game designers started to take the game throughout Middle-earth, certain characters had to be invented. Characters and settings had to be invented that felt true to Middle-earth, but didn't have to be necessarily true to the events of the Lord of the Rings. After all, you are sometimes putting together teams of characters that didn't really live at the same time. I'll tell you what, they succeeded in doing this. Individual characters in the game can have their own interesting backstories, even if they just sound like they're Lord of the Ringsy type names. That doesn't mean that they're just random names picked out of a hat. Some of them might be randomly picked out of a hat. I don't know about that. Berovor comes to mind, but take Brock Ironfist, for example. The blogger Master of Lore in 2015 did a deep dive on Brock Ironfist. The name Iron Fist is one of the families of dwarves, the 7 families of dwarves in Middle-earth. The dwarves we're familiar with, such as Gimli and Thorin, are Longbeards, and that's only one of the families of dwarves. In addition to the Longbeards, you had the Firebeards, the Broadbeams, the Blacklocks, the Stonefoots, the Stiffbeards, and the Iron Fists. I can't think of a better example of a card that helps you immerse yourself into the setting in a way that is not strictly from the established canon, but also doesn't violate it. And to make one more point for how the Lore of the card game incorporates the lore of Middle-earth in such a deft way as to make it
the greatest modern card game.
The actual setting of Middle-earth is great for this type of dancing on the fuzzy edges of established lore. You see, Tolkien created a universe where, and wrote in a way where he did not specify in excruciating detail everything that happened. Famously, the Silmarillion includes, if I'm not mistaken, no dialogue in the entire book. This is a book that's effectively the Bible for Middle-earth, and it tells many stories, but no one actually talks to each other. So if you want to make stories, not that anyone has the rights to, but if you wanted to make stories from the Silmarillion and expand on it, you could do that. And all the dialogue, there has to be some sort of a dialogue. I'm assuming everyone was on mute for all of the First Age, so adding that level of detail is both permissible and necessary to expanding on the lore. This is in contrast, for example, to Westeros in the Game of Thrones universe, where George R.R. Martin will take a page and a half describing what gets eaten during the course of a particular feast. if you make a game based on a Game of Thrones, you run a much higher risk of accidentally turning over a stone that was specified in page 374 of book 3, that stone, if moved, would unveil a dragon or something. I don't know. There's not much of a risk of doing that with Lord of the Rings. So it is not only a game that capitalizes and does a good job with expanding the lore, but it's doing so in a universe that is especially ready to be explored in that way. And that wraps up one of the reasons why I think this is
the greatest modern card game.
But it's not the only thing that makes it a great card game. Obviously, the game needs more than just lore. It needs to actually play well. For the next part of this retrospective, we'll dive into the basic mechanics of the game and what makes it one of the best cooperative experiences you can have on the tabletop.
Gotta look at the guy next to you. Look into his eyes. Now, I think you're gonna see a guy who will go that inch with you.
Hell yeah.
You're gonna see a guy who will sacrifice himself for this team because he knows when it comes down to it, you're gonna do the same for him.
Hell yeah.
That's a team, gentlemen.
Hell yeah.
And either we heal now as a team, or we will die as individuals.
It's time for part 2 of the Lord of the Rings card game retrospective, where I am explaining not only what the game is and all of its history, but what makes it the greatest modern card game. In part 1 of this series, which I will link to on screen, I think it's up there, we talked about the theme of Middle-earth and how that helps make this game the great piece of art that it is. The art's also very good. Today's video, we're going to get into the cooperative aspect of the game and how it actually plays, and how the way it executes on cooperative gameplay is part of what makes it the greatest modern card game. So let's name drop our weapons, get the hobbits out from behind the couch, and go win this game as a team.
You have my sword. And you have my bow.
And my axe.
Now this isn't going to be a how to play video, but I'm going to go over how it works, especially for those that have not played the game, so you understand a little bit of context here, because you might be coming to this video thinking, what is this game that is the greatest modern card game? Lord of the Rings, the card game, can be played solo or cooperatively. And it can be played from 1 to 4 players. Some expansions can be played up to 8 players. The way it works is like this. You and your friends, and we'll imagine for this scenario you have 2 friends. I don't know if that's a good thing. You can't get all your friends to play. Say you have 3 friends. You're sitting all at the table. I'm going to do my best, Tom Cruise Minority Report impression here. So you got right here, you got you, your buddy, and your pal. You each are going to be working together, and you're each going to bring a 50-card pre-constructed deck to the game. This deck is going to be constructed with cards that thankfully you didn't have to buy with booster packs, but that's more of a topic for a later video in this series. You're going to be going up against the quest, which there are many quests with the game. The core set comes with 3 quests. You're up against a quest. The quest has its own deck of cards, which is a mix of encounter sets that have been all shuffled together. The quest has the information of how you actually win the game. Have different stages represented by different cards, and that's up here. The encounter deck is going to be spitting out enemies into its play area, which is kind of the staging area of the game. It's kind of like the mosh pit of the game. It's just where enemies are going up to get in the way of you making progress. Meanwhile, each player has their own play area. In addition to their 50 card decks, they will each come with usually 3 heroes that begin the game in play. These heroes are key to how the decks operate. A round of Lord of the Rings, the card game, plays a little bit like this. Beginning of the round, the heroes in play for each of your friends will get 1 resource each. Each hero belongs to a sphere of influence, and almost every card belongs to a sphere of influence. So resources they get can pay for cards in their sphere. Once all the additions have been made to the proverbial fellowship, you and your friends will decide which of your characters are going to commit to the quest. They're going to be trying to go up and make progress on this quest. Once that decision's been made, because you don't know what you're up against yet, because once that decision has been made, the encounter deck is going to spit out 1 card per player. And they'll go into the staging area. There may be cards left in the staging area from previous rounds or from the scenario setup. Once it's done spitting out cards, and in some cases they'll spit out cards that will then lead to more cards being pulled out, things like that. If the willpower total is greater than the threat total, then you make progress. This is the main way you make progress in the game. After the result of the quest has been decided for this round, it's time to deal with kind of the spoils of what's going on the table. Players in the travel phase get to choose a location from the staging area and travel to it. What this means is they move it from the staging area and put it effectively as part of the main quest. Now that that's been dealt with, now you're going to deal with all these enemies. A lot of them are hanging out in the staging area, kind of looking at you ominously. You know, they're just kind of off in the distance. They're just eyeballing you as you're trying to make progress on your quest. They're going to come and attack you. And before I explain that, let me talk a little bit more about the resources each player has to work with here. You have resources that can put on your hero. Each player also has a hand of cards. By default, you draw one card per turn, and each card that you can play has a cost associated with it. Those are the main resources you're using to play the game. But everyone also has a threat number. Represents Sauron kind of looking at you and paying attention to you. I don't know who else you'd be paying attention to. Maybe the guy's playing at the other end of the game store. The stronger heroes you start with, the higher starting threat your team will begin with. Every round, your threat will go up by 1 at the end of the round. And if your threat ever hits 50, it's game over. So your threat functions as a little bit of a timer. There are times when you can reduce your threat, and sometimes it'll get increased. For example, if you fail in a quest, everyone's threat gets increased. It also functions as effectively visibility, or how enticing you are to the enemies in the staging area. So what happens after the travel phase, you have the engagement phase, where first each player gets to choose one to engage, because sometimes you want to kind of game that a little bit and choose who you actually take off. You want to fight some enemies early to keep the staging area clear, because after all, the staging area is what's slowing down your questing progress. But then after everyone picks one, anyone else that is at the key number will see an enemy show up, and then you start the fight. Combat phase begins with, of course, because all these games work like this, you defend first. Any of those characters you committed to the quest are now exhausted, so they can't be used. They're just really tired. They're just like hanging out there saying like, you know, you do it. I can't, I'm too exhausted. When an enemy attacks, every attack gets another card dealt to it. It's called a shadow card. The majority of the cards in the game have shadow effects, and they're usually something like making the attack worse. After all the enemies have had their chance to have a swing at you, then you finally get to fight back. But again, if a character has defended, they are also exhausted. So only the characters you have left are ready to go. So the game is about risk management, fundamentally. You are deciding who to send to the quest without knowing how much you really need. You're making a judgment call there. And you're going to decide who's defending against incoming attacks without knowing what exactly you need. Only with what's left can you then make your board state better by actually attacking and getting rid of guys. So it's a risk management factor with many factors of variance in play. There is no scenario in the game where you can 100% guarantee that you will complete the quest, at least outside of maybe like the first quest out of the core set. This isn't really a simple game. You have your resources, you have your cards. You don't just play cards, you have to use resources to pay for cards, and you have the whole sphere match thing. You have randomness in the questing phase with the staging area and encounter cards. You have randomness with attacks and how enemies attack you. And you have obviously the randomness of your own card draw. There's a lot going on in the game and a lot of different levers that you can pull. You're constantly balancing, say, not having your heroes destroyed with risking having your threat increase, deciding whether or not to spend resources for cheap cards now or to save up for expensive cards later. There's a lot that you can do here. And it's in this interesting potpourri of complexity that the game shines as a cooperative experience. The way you measure how fun a game is partly measured by how great the game's best moments are. That will be, for a lot of games, deciding who wins a game. So if you play a multiplayer game, the moment where you find out who wins the game, whether by a flip of a card or by everyone revealing what they've kept to themselves while they built up a board state, or in some cases by just who's done the math correctly, it's the climax of the game. With a cooperative game, you experience that moment together. This climax of whether or not you all collectively win a cooperative game can be one of the greatest moments in board gaming. Now, cooperative gaming isn't for everybody. Some people prefer to play individual games, just like some people prefer to play individual sports. Winning as a team is different than winning as an individual. Even if it's not for everybody, compare, say, someone winning a golf tournament to a team winning the World Series.
The last 20 gives up 2 hits, and he picks up.
You don't have a dog pile when you win a golf tournament, at least not that I'm aware of. There's something to be said about winning a game where everybody on your team contributed. So a good cooperative game has the highest upside in terms of what that climax is like in a game. And if a game can reach that climax reliably, it's a very good game. Not all cooperative games do this successfully. You see, a lot of cooperative games fall victim to the quarterbacking problem. One player on the team knows the game much better than everyone else, knows what everyone else should be doing on their turn, And whether or not you win is coming down mostly to whether or not that player won, rather than everyone contributing something to the game. It's as if your quarterback were Peyton Manning and your wide receiver were some 12-year-old kid.
Suck.
I'll use an example. The most famous cooperative board game is Pandemic, and Pandemic is an excellent gateway game, and it's a very fun game to play if everyone at the table has a similar skill level and similar experience level within the game. However, Pandemic reaches a point where if you play the game 10 times, 20 times, you're not only going to know what to do in your turn, you pretty much know what everyone else should do. There's not any real hidden information in the game between the players. It's not so complex that you can't figure it out yourself. You can definitely play the app by yourself, for example, and have no problem at all. The players who are new to the game don't feel like they actually have anything to offer, and the players who are experienced are either not mentioning all of their good ideas, or they're gonna just be, telling you what to do. It's not a fun dynamic. So Pandemic is famous for suffering from the quarterback problem. In fact, that's why the first expansion for the game had the Bioterrorist expansion, is to give that really experienced player something else to do besides just tell everyone else how to make their turn. So a good cooperative board game, or card game, or sport, I guess for that matter, needs to address the quarterbacking problem in some way. Now, I'm no board game designer, but one of the simplest ways you can make a game impossible to quarterback is make it so complicated that no one person is realistically going to be able to juggle all the decisions you have to make in the game. That's not to say that all flavors of complexity are equal. What we're going to do here is we're going to compare two very good games and how they pull off their versions of solving the quarterback problem. We have the Lord of the Rings the card game. I would hope that was one of the examples here. And we're going to compare it also to Spirit Island. Spirit Island is a highly acclaimed board game, especially among board game enthusiasts. Spirit Island is a cooperative game that is a step up in complexity from Pandemic. Every player has a hand of cards, and the game has a lot more going on than in Pandemic. As a result, it solves the quarterbacking problem, at least for the most part. You have to really be playing with a mega expert in the game to have a quarterbacking problem with Spirit Island. Maybe not mega expert. To kind of explain how Lord of the Rings card game is different, I'm going to just make up a chart here. This is a chart where, for Pandemic, for example, the more experience you have with the game, the more your skill will go up. And you will, as your skill goes up, be able to effectively play for 1 or 2 or 3 players, etc. So what you want with a game is skill to matter. You want it to increase. You don't want the complexity to be so high that when you're new to the game that you just can't even do anything, that you just are terrible at it. You don't want that. To avoid quarterbacking, you want to make it so that experienced players aren't able to handle 2 or 3 or 4 different characters.
That's bad. Okay.
Now you see, this is the line for Pandemic. Spirit Island, by being a more complex game, lowers this line. When you're new to the game, you're not nearly as good. And even when you're experienced, you're not at the point where you can handle many, many players. The problem with Spirit Island is that when you are new, it is really hard. Like, Spirit Island, when you first start, it's a really hard game. Like, don't get me wrong. A lot of people might hear me say that and say, like, it's not that hard. Trust me. When you first start, it's hard. Good luck busting this out with quasi-casual board gamers. Good luck ever being asked to be the one to pick a game again. What the Lord of the Rings the card game does is, you see, it's complex, but it flattens the line a little bit. For newer players, it's not quite as bad as Spirit Island. And then for the more experienced players, their advantage over the newer players isn't as great. There is absolutely an advantage to being good at the game. It's kind of limitless how good you could get at this game if you keep learning it. Here's how it does this. Spirit Island, despite having your own hand of cards, is relatively deterministic. There's some randomness as you're playing this game in terms of what your adversary is going to do. So you're trying to keep settlers off of an island. Where they're going to show up is not determined, but there are only so many different options. You can kind of think ahead of what's going to happen within the round while you're playing it. You have your hand of cards, but everyone's kind of picking from the same deck of cards. There's really just a lot of actions you can do in your turn. That's where a lot of the complexity comes from. It's not all hidden information, it's partly hidden information. Where Lord of the Rings the card game gets its randomness, or gets its complexity, comes with the fact that not only there's a lot of hidden information, the enemy is less deterministic because the enemy has a much more interesting deck of cards to draw from. You'll have different styles of enemies pop up, different locations will pop up, treacheries. The mix could be anything. And this chance factor, this randomness, if you will, balances the playing field between the newer and more experienced players. An experienced player, they might make a decision that is the right one for 70% of the cards that might come out in the encounter deck in a round. And the newer player might make a decision that is better for the remaining 30% of the cards. That's not that much of an endorsement for the experienced player. The newer player has thought out their turn more than the experienced player. You're going to go with it, and you might end up being right. That's the main difference. A Spirit Island game, the experienced player will be right about what to do if they truly know what's going on, probably 90% of the time. The way the Lord of the Rings card game is able to pull off this level of randomness without being completely useless comes from all the different mini mechanics. So you have your own deck randomness, you have the randomness of the encounter depth, you have the randomness of shadow effects. You all know when those points of randomness are coming. It's not like you have randomness where your whole game comes down to one die roll, and if you roll a 6, you lose. That's not fun. You have multiple dice that are being effectively rolled with all these different decks of cards, and you're choosing which ones you want to mitigate. That's a bad analogy. You're spinning multiple plates of randomness trying to keep them all up. You don't just have one giant plate that just you're trying to spin. It uses randomness, and it uses it well. Because of that, the Lord of the Rings the card game makes those fun cooperative experiences happen much more often than games like Spirit Island, even than games like Pandemic. I remember the first time I ever played the Lord of the Rings the card game with friends. It was a 3-player game because these friends of mine were relatively limber when it came to playing games. We played Passes Through Mirkwood, which is kind of like the introductory quest of the game in the core set, and then we jumped right into Escape from Dol Guldur. For 3 players isn't as bad as it is for 1 or 2. And we beat the scenario, despite the fact that, again, these players had never played this game before. One of my friends, I realized at the end of the game, he was referring to Legolas as Nicholas for the entire time, because it was one of my heroes. He never actually read the card. He just thought we were saying Nicholas. For Spirit Island, I mean, I talked about not being allowed to bust out games again or select games again. It's kind of a running joke between my wife and I that I am never allowed to attempt to play Spirit Island again because it has always failed when getting friends, and again, even board game savvy friends, to play a cooperative game and have fun with it. The game often takes a very long time, cognitive load is too high, and you still lose. Kind of sucks. So that's when the Lord of the Rings card game is good, which for the majority of the scenarios, especially the later release scenarios, it's good. You get those cooperative moments. It's a great time. That's it for part 2 of the Lord of the Rings retrospective. In part 3, we're going to go back in time, specifically to 2011 when the game was released, and walk through how the game's card pool used for deck construction was amassed over the years. Remember to subscribe to Jack Sportfield's Game Room to see part 3 when it's released, and I'll see you in the next episode. The year is 2011.
Finally, the filming of The Hobbit is underway. Sir Peter Jackson.
All you non-believers, disrespect us.
This is The Lord of the Rings, the card game. It's by Fantasy Flight Games, and it's a living card game.
Can't wait.
2011 saw the release of the greatest modern card game, The Lord of the Rings, the card game. But the game wasn't the greatest card game yet. In fact, it would take several years before the game could claim that perch. There are 3 things that make the Lord of the Rings a card game great. In part 1 of this series, we talked about the lore of Middle-earth and how it's a great environment in which to set your expandable card game. Part 2 of this series, we talked about cooperative play and how the Lord of the Rings the card game makes you feel like you're really part of a fellowship. Today, we're going to go back in time and relive the development of this game from that of a grumpy little halfling of a game to one whose card pool is commensurate with being the greatest modern card game. When I tell people that my favorite card game is Lord of the Rings the card game, but it needs a healthy dose of expansions to really get the full experience, people are understandably a little bit frustrated by that. They'll say things like, well, I was looking for something to play instead of Love Letter. That's a bit much to ask. And that's fair. It's as if I came and said my favorite car was the Ultimate GTR, which is a kit car you have to buy from Great Britain and build in your garage. So when I said, I was like, well, I was kind of just sick of my Ultimate. I wanted something more realistic. That's not the right comparison for Lord of the Rings the card game. There's a whole other niche of the tabletop gaming hobby that isn't really even a part of board gaming, and that is the trading card game hobby, or collectible card games. Games like Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon trading card game, Magic the Gathering. Each of these games is a hobby in and of itself. There's a meta to chase. You'll spend more money on any of these games than you would the Lord of the Rings the card game. But funnily enough, if someone came to you and said their favorite game was the Pokemon trading card game, most people wouldn't even bat an eye. Be like, oh, I get it. It's as if, a 4-year-old came to you and said their favorite car is a Bugatti. Or actually, if anybody came to you and said their favorite car is a Bugatti. So like, oh yeah, I get it. Which isn't really fair to the Lord of the Rings the card game. After all,
I like money.
To pick on Pokemon for a little bit, all of the releases for the game are really just kind of just repackages of the same stuff. Yeah, you get new cards over time, but mechanically there's not too much going on. And within sets of cards, you'll just have different packages of just basically booster packs and some promo cards and sleeves just packaged a little bit differently every time.
Tortilla with cheese, meat, or vegetables.
It's like how Jim Gaffigan describes Mexican food.
It's almost a conspiracy.
Obviously, with Lord of the Rings the card game, you don't have the chase for the rare cards.
No way.
But to all of our benefit, in the late 2000s and early 2010s, Fantasy Flight Games peered into this taco-filled Bugatti that was trading card gaming, and it found something, and it pulled out of the flames something that was worth preserving.
What are you doing?
There were markings.
In the effort of wrestling deck construction away from trading card games, Fantasy Flight Games created the living card game model, which is a card game that's expandable, but does not rely on booster packs. Rather, you buy packs with known cards. Fantasy Flight Games made 11 of these games, 3 of which were cooperative, and Lord of the Rings the card game was the first of the cooperative living card games. Not all of these games were successful. By 2024, only 3 of the original 11 living card games were still in circulation. Just so happens, it was the 3 cooperative games. Safe to say, there's something about deck construction in a cooperative environment where you don't have to chase a meta, but obviously you need a bit of a card pool to make that experience rewarding. So let's walk through how this card pool for Lord of the Rings the card game was built out, starting with 2011's core set. Upon cracking open the Lord of the Rings the card game core set, of which I prefer actually the original cover art, slightly over the revised edition, you had different categories of cards to look through. On the player card side, you had hero cards, which exist outside your deck but are nonetheless a part of your team, and all the player cards consisting of allies, events, and attachments. As far as the enemies, you have encounter cards and the actual quests cards, representing the 3 different quests that your fellowships would embark on. Starting first with the hero cards. Now, when you have the beginning of a game like this, you have to consider that they know expansions are coming. So the heroes in the core set weren't necessarily all the most famous heroes from the story of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. You had Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas. That makes sense. You gotta have the 3 hunters. You also had famous figures from the movies. You had Éowyn as a major character from The Two Towers and Return of the King. Instead of a hero like Éomer or Theoden, you had Theodred, who had very limited screen time in the movie. Provide an interesting way to actually get to play Theodred, since we never got to really know him that well. You had Glóin, Gimli's father, who actually seemed pretty old for the setting here. He was actually really more of a Hobbit hero. Immediately starts to show how the game will be mixing time frames a bit, especially between characters from The Hobbit versus characters during the time of the Lord of the Rings. Glorfindel was not actually mentioned in the movies, but those familiar with Middle-earth at large are familiar with Glorfindel, who's so OP they didn't even send him on the Fellowship. Then, interestingly, you had Denethor, who's really more of a bad guy, at least in the movies. So it was a little bit strange to be going with him as a Gondor hero as opposed to someone like Boromir or Faramir right out of the core set. Then you had a lot of characters that were carryovers from Middle-earth quests, like Thalin and Beravor. What sticks out amongst these heroes are a few things. First of all of the heroes have a threat cost that is equal to the sum of all of their traits. So that's willpower, attack, defense, and health. For example, Aragorn has a cost of 12. He has willpower of 2, attack of 3, defense of 2, and health of 5. The fact that all of the heroes were costed this way means that there are going to be better values than others. In the game, you don't get to use all of your traits every turn. Your heroes aren't as valuable as all your traits put together. It's really as valuable as the traits you're able to utilize. So there are going to be some overcosted heroes and some undercosted ones. Glorfindel, for example, ended up being a very overcosted hero. It's not clear whether or not the designers knew this when they first put together the core set. Also of note, Éowyn's 4 willpower, being 2 more than Aragorn, 1 more than Glorfindel. Éowyn is a great character. 4 was a tough number to beat. Like, that's really thinking, like, twice as much willpower as Aragorn until he gets some certain attachments on him. Éowyn was a beast and was a card that many people needed to use to survive the scenarios of the core set. Some notable player cards. Within the leadership cards, you had wins and losses. For example, the very inexpensive Snowborn Scout become a staple of many decks, while the significantly overcosted Brock Ironfist would rarely see play. On the tactics side, most notable was the 6-cost Beorn, who was actually a stronger battler than any of the heroes, and was a card that many people, their entire strategy would be centered around trying to get Beorn into play. Amongst the Spirit allies, you had Wandering Took, who looks quite a bit like Pippin, and I'll mention there were no Hobbit heroes in the actual core set, which is probably a good decision, to be honest. With the game being so new, it wasn't clear how to make a hero with low attributes be really an effective hero. It seemed to be a bit hit and miss. But the Hobbits would be coming later. The rules of Lord of the Rings, the card game, allow you to have 3 of every player card, but the core set did not give you 3 of every card, and it knew to a certain extent which cards were better and gave you less of them to play with. For example, Dwarven Tomb, which allows you to reuse an event card, you only got 1 copy of that in the core set. You only got 2 copies of the resource-generating Steward of Gondor attachment. Almost certainly the greatest ally in the game was Gandalf. Even today, after a decade to build in the car pool, it's difficult to not include Gandalf, and 3 copies of that at Gandalf in every deck that you build. But the game controlling which cards you can include 3 of created 2 things. 1, it increased the difficulty of the quests in the core set, but 2, provided another reason to get multiple copies of the core set. You see, the core set was originally designed to be for 2 players, and the idea is you would buy 2 copies of the core set to play with 4. This seemed like a bit of a intentional gaming of the product line by Fantasy Flight. Honestly, how much would it really have been to include just a couple more threat trackers and the materials needed to play with 4 players? Probably not that much, which is why also the game kind of changed that with the revised core set. Amongst the player cards, you also had cards that weren't clear what their purpose was. For example, the Son of Arnor, leadership ally of cost 3 and attack 2 with no defense and no willpower. When you put Son of Arnor into play, you took an enemy and engaged it with you, despite the fact that Son of Arnor is not very strong. It wasn't obvious at the time how to use Son of Arnor, and Son of Arnor didn't become a useful card until other Dunedain cards came out much later, years later. So it's safe to say your deck building options in the game were limited. For the enemy cards, you had a mix of enemies, some spiders, some orcs, Hummerhorns, which are somewhat of a terrifying enemy to face, even both in the game and anybody that has a fear of bees. You had a large number of encounter cards that did not have a shadow effect. By the most recent expansions of the game, the vast majority of enemy cards would have shadow effects, making the combat phase of each round much more exciting. The Marsh Adder looks incredibly beefy, but never got much of a story behind it. It was like the game was allowing a yada 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 for these truly terrifying enemies, but if nothing else, was providing amazing artwork. That's something that's been true from the beginning for really, well, all of Fantasy Flight's Lord of the Rings properties, because they reuse a lot of the same artwork. I keep mentioning this just as a footnote throughout this video series because I don't even know how to fully give credit to it. And apparently the originals for this artwork were all lost. The same commenter on Reddit keeps pointing that out to me, and I hope that's not true, but if it is true, that's kind of a tragedy. But the artwork in the Lord of the Rings card game is some of the best artwork, maybe the best artwork I've ever seen in a game. And it's a mix of illustrators, too. We have Winona Nelson, Alexander Sheldon, Jason Ward, Gen Z, Florian Stiltz, Mark Winters, Lauren Fetterman, David Licosu, Drew Whitmore, John Wigley, Magali Villeneuve, maybe the best of all of them. It's too many to name. But back to the cards. The core set famously came out with 3 quests: a passage through Mirkwood, journey down the Anduin, and escape from Dol Guldur. Passage through Mirkwood was an easy quest, and the only way you were going to have any challenge beating a passage through Mirkwood is if you were using half decks that you could begin the game with. See, the game came out with just enough cards for you to have roughly 25 card decks for each of the 4 spheres of influence in the game. So you can start off, you could play with a tactics deck, a spirit deck, a lore deck, or a leadership deck, meaning that you took the 3 heroes from that sphere, and all the player cards for that sphere, throw Gandalf in there, and that's your deck. All of these half decks could realistically beat a passage through Mirkwood, except for tactics. The tactics deck was completely unworkable right out of the core set. And the problem is because it just didn't have the willpower to complete any of the quests. Your main tool for getting quest progress was Legolas and his ability to add progress to a quest upon taking an enemy out. If you use Gimli for questing every round, you're not going to have Gimli available as your strongest defender and attacker. And Thalin, even though he's going to be committed to every quest, is only doing 1 willpower each turn. So the tactics deck was immediately relegated to being a support deck, which is fine, but for people that are starting out in the game and they want to stay focused on tactics, it was not a great introduction to the game itself. But nonetheless, if you built decks that were 2 sphere decks or played with 2 players, you had a little bit more of a chance to beat the other scenarios. A journey down the Anduin and then escape from Dol Guldur. But man, those quests were hard. Journey down the Anduin sets you off against a hill troll enemy that's in play from the beginning of the game, that you have to build your deck around. Escape from Dal Guldur is made more difficult the less players you have because one hero begins the game trapped. So if you only have 3 heroes and you're playing by yourself, that's 1/3 of your heroes that are trapped. You almost have to play with multiple players to have a chance at completing that quest. The challenge of these quests was both a blessing and a curse. It was a curse because a lot of people probably played the game and just never came back to it, and understandably so. But if you did play this game and you enjoyed it in spite of the quest challenges, you would be rewarded. You see, these quests function somewhat as a filtering mechanism for the player base. And as a result, it's almost as if you bought the game, with whatever chance that you're going to like it right off the bat, there's something like a 10 to 20% chance that you're going to start a blog around it because you liked it that much. And the benefit of these content creators came almost immediately. For example, given that the quests were so hard, some guy on Board Game Geek named Ninja Dorg came up with his own 6 quests that served as somewhat of a medium difficulty series of quests. These quests, and one of my favorite aspects of them, is they use cards such as Chieftain Uftak, which is a unique enemy that had nothing else special to do in the core set. It was just an enemy that came up with no story behind him. I mean, the guy, he gets experience as he plays. How can he not be an important character? My favorite deck for the Lord of the Rings card games core set is actually in the Hall of Fame on RingsDB. It's called Back to Basics. It's made by Xanalore, and it was made in 2016, but obviously could have been made with just a core set back in 2011. But here's how the deck works. It's a mix of 3 spheres. It's a 4-sphere deck. It has Beorn as an ally, which is a 6-cost tactics ally. But the way you get Beorn in play is you discard him, and then you stand and fight to pay for him with spirit resources. Now think about the thought that has to go into a deck like that. That's a real power deck, and it's using purely the mechanics on the cards. This is not a Rohan deck. It is not a Gondor deck. It's not a Dwarf deck. It's a deck that has been finely tuned by someone that truly deeply understands the game, and this deck is actually very good. That emphasizes the point, though, that because the game was so difficult right off the bat, it had its own filtering mechanism. It helped make the player base the great one that has followed the game for over 10 years. The core set didn't give you much in the way of thematic deck building. There was no one trait you had enough of to build decks, but that started to change with the expansions that came out later in 2011. You see, the players that survived the filter were treated to expansions fairly early in the game's lifespan, as that was a given. The game was going to get expansions. 2011 not only saw the core set, but also saw the release of the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle. 3 months after the release of the core set saw the Hunt for Gollum expansion released. And the header for the Hunt for Gollum was Bilbo Baggins. Bilbo was the first Hobbit hero in the game. It was also the first hero whose cost was more than the sum of his traits. Bilbo's ability, which allowed the first player to draw an extra card every turn, the designers realized was going to be worth a bit. You needed to have a cost that was greater than 6. Although it did lead to a bit of an interesting time in the game. Obviously, with a new expansion, everyone's going to want to use as many cards as possible from this expansion, and throwing Bilbo in as a hero is a very kind of a niche hero, but you saw a lot of Bilbo decks at the time, just because we had something finally new to play with. This expansion, you also saw the hints of the 2 deck archetypes that we built out throughout the Shadow of Mirkwood cycle. In the Hunt for Gollum, you had Winged Guardian and the Eagles Are Coming, which were the beginning of Eagles decks. And you had Westfold, Horsebreaker, and Mustering of the Rohirrim, which started to build towards Rohan decks. These decks were still several expansions away from becoming real archetypes. One thing that was also made clear with this expansion is that the game was not going to fall victim to power creep. Only one of the player cards in this expansion cost more than 2. And that was the Rivendell Minstrel. That's something that trading card games will often fall victim to. Just look at the growth of, say, number of hit points against cards in the Pokemon trading card game. The quest for the Hunt for Gollum was fine enough and was definitely fit in as an easier quest than Journey Down the Anduin and Escape from Dal Guldur. Although it was a quest that definitely was a little bit rough around the edges, as too many hunters from Mordor could make the game almost impossible for you to complete, and you have to take multiple tries at it. And at this point in the game's life, its design was not well refined. We're talking about the child of the game in its early years. It is not fully grown yet. The second expansion of the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle was Conflict at the Carrick, which now saw another Hobbit hero, but this time it was Frodo. And Frodo was a very good hero. His cost was back to the sum of its traits, but Frodo was effectively a defender that lets you turn damage into threat increase, which is something that is easier to control than damage. So Frodo was actually a strong hero that's featured in a lot of decks, even after the newness of Conflict at the Carrick wore off. You had another Eagles card in Born Aloft, and a couple more Rohan cards with Nor Am I a Stranger and Aomund. You also had a Burning Brand, which ended up being one of the strongest attachments in the history of the game. You had the second Song card, which was the game's way of allowing resource smoothing, which basically added a resource sphere to one of your heroes. And the quest itself of Conflict at the Carrot was much more interesting than the Hunt for Gollum. You were playing out the scene from The Hobbit, effectively, where you were faced with a number of different trolls, and you had to get rid of the trolls in a controlled fashion. You had the help of objective ally, Grim Beorn the Old, and you got the beginning of Beorning decks with the Beorning Beekeeper, which would take over 5 years before that archetype got filled out. A Conflict at the Carrack was far from a perfect quest. Many found that it was their favorite at this point in the game. Next up was A Journey to Rhosgobel, which in my opinion was the game's attempt to make healing more valuable. After all, you had several cards from the core set: Glorfindel, Daughter of the Nimrodel, the Lore of Enladris, Beorn's Hospitality, Self-Preservation, all these healing cards that when people played the game, you found you really didn't even use that much. So the Journey to Rhosgobel gave you someone you needed to heal, the Eagle Williador. The player cards further built on the themes of Eagle decks with Landroval, a nice beefy ally, and To the Eyrie, but also Radagast, who was an interesting ally that could actually collect resources and use them to pay for eagles. So that's why Escort from Edoras filled out your Rohan decks. Although your hero for this expansion set was Prince Imrahil, the Gondorian prince who has a much bigger role in the books than he did in the movies. Journey to Rhosgobel was followed up by the Hills of Emin Muil. The hero of this expansion was Bran, son of Bane, or Bine, who's the son of Bard, so we're talking a little bit farther removed from the characters of The Hobbit. You had more eagles with Descendant of Thorondor and Meneldor's Flight. You had the Riddermark's Finest and Ride to Ruin to build out your Rohan decks. The 5-cost Gildor and Glorian was maybe the strongest ally outside of Beorn to be released so far. And you also got another Hobbit, which is nice. But the Hills of Emin Muil tried to be a quest that focused on location exploring. And I'll tell you what, many people will say the Hills of Emin Muil is the weakest quest in the history of the game. At this point in the game's history, we're seeing different quest types be tested out. Some to great success and some less so. The newness of the game shone brightly. It didn't quite know how to pull off all the things that it wanted to do. The Dead Marshes came next, where you had Boromir hero, he's so strong that he eventually would get nerfed. You had Vassal of the Wind Lord as an excellent Eagle ally that will be used in decks that weren't even necessarily Eagles decks. Spirit kept building into the Rohan theme with Elfhelm and We Do Not Sleep. And you had the last of the Song card attachment, Song of Battle, which now that there is an attachment for every sphere which you can use for resource smoothing. The mechanic that the Dead Marshes quest puts out there is the idea of an escape test. Effectively, a second quest within each round, which is an interesting mechanic that would be used at times later on in the game and to a little bit more success, but wasn't necessarily a fun addition yet. And then finally, you had Return to Mirkwood. This last expansion of the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle finished off the Eagles decks with Eagles of the Misty Mountains and Support of the Eagles. These cards allowed you to take Eagles cards, which were frequently leaving play quickly after being used one time, and gave you something to do with those cards. So you had a deck archetype that you could work with the Eagles cards, but it took a lot to get going and wasn't overly strong. We're talking about cards where you need to get 3 or 4 different kinds of cards working together. There's a reason why the Eagles of the Misty Mountains did not become one of the starter decks when starter decks were released about 10 years later, is because that archetype just wasn't a great one. It was overshadowed by the Rohan decks, which were finished off with Westroad Traveler and Astonishing Speed. Although it was also interesting in this cycle how Tactics was the Eagles set here and Spirit was Rohan. Nonetheless, Rohan decks were actually fairly strong and were really the only archetype you had to play with here. And I'll come back to Rohan decks in a moment. The quest for Return to Mirkwood was another imperfect quest, as you had an absurdly powerful spider enemy, Addercop, which alludes to the names that Bilbo would call the spiders in The Hobbit, that would try to follow Gollum, who was now under your possession. But as the first player token moved, whoever had Gollum was really in for a tough go of it. This quest was nearly impossible to complete solo, especially if you were trying to build out fun thematic decks instead of power decks like the Back to Basics deck we talked about earlier. And it's fair to say that at this point in the history of the game that was the main thing that was lacking. It was the ability to make thematic decks. And the game was still difficult. You thought the quests in the Shadows of Mirkwood set were hard. You thought the quests in the core set were hard. Check out the first Gen Con release, Massing Out as Gileath. This quest is one of the first ones that took me, I think, a dozen times to beat. I was finally successful once with a combination of Eowyn, Theodred, and Daenerys, so it was a Rohan deck, because that was the only thing I had to work with at the time. Talking super strong enemies, surging enemies, you know, the game was there to challenge you. But the designers seemed to know that it was a little bit too hard, because the hero in the final expansion of Shadows of Mirkwood was Dane Ironfoot. Dane Ironfoot would go down as one of the strongest heroes in the history of the game. Not just because he's a strong card, being a dwarf with 5 health, 3 defense, but because of how many dwarves would be coming around the corner. And with that, we end the childhood phase of Lord of the Card Game. And in the next video in this series, you will all be introduced to Dwarf Swarm. But remember to subscribe if you want to see part 4, where we see the game through its adolescent phase and talk a little bit more about the content creators that I've alluded to that sprang up out of this filtering mechanism that was the first year of the game's life. This was the first video in the series that I filmed without using any footage that I recorded at 4 a.m. doing colonoscopy prep. And anything with the Jets fleece, you know, that was putting me in the mood to get a colonoscopy, I guess.
It takes a lot to make a stew.
A pinch of salt and laughter too.
A scoop of kids to add the spice.
A dash of love to make it nice. And you've got
too many cooks.
too many cooks.
Too many cooks. Too many cooks. Too many cooks.
Too many cooks. It takes a lot to make a stew.
When it comes to
As the Lord of the Rings the card game entered its second year of existence in 2012, it experienced a game's version of a perfect storm. You had a player base that, having tasted a bit of what the game can do, were hungry for more expansions and more deck archetypes. As it is a deck construction game, that's one of the ways you have fun with the game. At the same time, with a year of experience under their belts, the designers of the Lord of the Rings the card game were ready to serve that meal up, as they had the experience building the relatively successful Rohan archetype and the relatively unsuccessful Eagles archetype. So it's safe to say the designers could make a deck archetype that the players can use. The third component to this perfect storm came in the form of a movie. The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey was due for release in December of 2012. There's a rare chance for Fantasy Flight Games to use an already released game to capitalize on a release from the intellectual property. And if you've seen The Hobbit, if you're familiar with that story, there are a lot of dwarves. You know, the players are like, we want a deck. And the designers are like, you want a deck? Here's a deck.
Carmichael.
You're right. We have too many dwarves.
The resulting Dwarf Swarm deck archetype had more than enough dwarves to drown both George Clooney and Mark Wahlberg and Bill Fichtner at that point. Was this flooding of vertically challenged characters a bit of an overcorrection? Sure. But overcorrections for childhood and exaggerated personality types are what adolescence is all about. Adolescence is also a time for building some potentially lifelong friendships, as many content creators for Lord of the Rings the card game emerge in this period. So get comfortable on Jackson Warfield's therapy couch, because in part 4 today, we'll be unpacking the adolescent years of the Lord of the Rings the card game.
Who is that? He doesn't look very happy.
It is dead, Lord of the Iron Hills. Sauron's cousin.
Like dwarves digging for Mithril, we will continue to dig through the different expansions that came out in January of 2012. The first deluxe expansion for the Lord of the Rings the card game was released, Khazad-dûm, which would then be followed by the Dworodelf cycle, which, if you actually look to what those names mean, they mean the same thing. Khazad-dûm and Dworodelf was the first example of expansions for Lord of the Rings the card game. It's tough enough when you have an expansion where you have to write on the box to say, this is an expansion to another game, don't buy this by itself. Even I have made the mistake once of buying an expansion for a game and not buying the actual game. I thought it was an expand-alone, not with Lord of the Rings. It was actually with Stuffed Fables. But nonetheless, if you wanted to play all the scenarios of the Dworodelf cycle, you needed to have both the core set for Lord of the Rings and the Khazad-dûm expansion. With 10 years to learn from producing games, Fantasy Flight would get rid of the expansion of expansion model when they re-released and repackaged some of the Lord of the Rings the card game content, but that is more of a topic for another video. Khazad-dûm itself featured 2 heroes, Dwalin and Bifur, which brings our number of dwarf heroes up to 6, where you have Glóin, Gimli, and Thalin from the core set, Dine Ironfoot from the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle, and now Dwalin and Bifur. You got 3 dwarf allies. My favorite card from this set was probably the Dwarven Axe, which I don't understand how anyone can say that the Dwarven Axe is better than the Dwarven Axe. One of note here was also the Sigil Miner. You see, the Sigil Miner was arguably the first truly broken card in Lord of the Rings, the card game. There were a number of cards throughout the game's early years that ended up needing an errata, but the Sigil Miner was perhaps the most extreme, and people knew it right from the get-go. You effectively had 2 dwarf deck styles that were in their infancy here, using lots of different terms, euphemisms for age, I guess. You had dwarf decks which centered around Dyne Ironfoot. Dyne would give strong willpower across the board, and the goal was just get as many dwarves out as possible. That was the dwarf swarm deck. You also had dwarf mining decks, which is more along the lines of what Sigil Miner does, which was dig through your deck or discard pile to find cards and build resources that way. The quests of Khazad-dûm were not anything to write home about. Now, it was a welcome break to not need to see the Necromancer's Reach anymore. After all, the encounter cards from the core set you saw used throughout the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle, so some of your most disliked encounter cards would show up many times. This was the first expansion that did not use any encounter sets from the core set. My biggest impression from Khazad-dûm was the fact that you had a mix of small little orcs, or really goblins, but they're, kind of the same thing, and really large trolls that would even make the hill troll from the core set seem small. The 3 quests within Khazad-dûm were Into the Pit, which saw the heroes breaking into Moria, the 7th level, which was getting to the 7th level of Moria, and Flight from Moria, where they escape Moria. If that sounds familiar, it's because it is. It's similar to the Fellowship's trip through Moria in the Lord of the Rings story, although it is a separate adventure. For example, the quest does reference Balin's tomb. Only 2 months later, players were graced with another expansion. This was the Red Horn Gate. Red Horn Gate's hero was actually not a dwarf. It was Elrond's son, Elrohir. And Elrohir mentioned Eladon, which is Elrond's other son. Elrohir and Eladon are twins. Eladon was not quite available, although you would be able to buy that set within about a month or so. The Red Horn Gate is notable for introducing, or attempting to introduce, secrecy decks. You see, the Lord of the Rings card game never required that you choose 3 heroes to start every quest, yet almost everyone chose 3 heroes. In fact, I don't think I saw any competitive decks in the early life of the game that used only 2 heroes, God forbid only 1 hero. The designers left that open. They didn't require 3 heroes, so they wanted you to be able to go with 2 as a different strategy, add some variety to the game. They saw this wasn't happening. My only assumption is that's why they introduced secrecy. Secrecy cards were cards you could buy at a discount, provided your threat was 20 or less. And Timely Aid was the first of those cards. That deck archetype would eventually go very well with some other cards that would be released. It did not fit very well with dwarves, and really wasn't a thing in the early stages here of the Dwarven cycle. The Red Horn Gate refers to Caradhras, which is the mountain that the Fellowship failed to pass in the Fellowship of the Ring.
We will go through the mines.
And thus went to Moria. So again, our story is a little bit, if not unoriginal, maybe a little bit uninspired. There's another way that the designers of the game were maturing in their storytelling direction. Road to Rivendell brought out Elrohir's twin brother Eladon, a couple more secrecy cards, and some more dwarf cards, including Lure of Moria, which allows you to ready all dwarves, which, given how many doors you have at this point, is that's a lot of dwarves. The game also had the beginnings of another broken combo that would need to be eroded with the Song of Eärendil. When paired with Wandering Took from the core set, would allow you to massage threat levels between 2 players as much as you want. It's already kind of strange to allow, but we get even stranger with following expansions. What Road to Rivendell is really known for is having the single worst encounter card in the history of the game, with Sleeping Sentry. If you revealed Sleeping Sentry, you had to deal 1 damage to every exhausted character and then exhaust already characters. Which means that if you got another Sleeping Sentry after it, the already exhausted characters would get another damage, and now everyone else would get 1 damage. It was really bad. In fact, it's like Necromancer's Reach on Lemba's bread. As a shadow effect, probably even worse, because you had to discard all exhausted characters. This was another example of game design that is just not really fair. You could not play this game without a Test of Will and Hasty Stroke as cancellation effects. In fact, you had to pretty much bust out Eleanor from the core set, if not fully cancel, at least prevent certain when revealed effects from firing. This is probably one of the less replayed quests in the history of the game because of Sleeping century. Also of note is you had objective ally Arwen. Became an ally that you could play in the Watcher in the Water. The Watcher in the Water is a fan favorite quest that was one of the first boss fights in the history of the game. All of the enemies in the Watcher in the Water were pretty much tentacles coming from the Watcher. So if you know that scene in The Lord of the Rings, that's what the Watcher in the Water quest was. The Watcher in the Water was also the Aragorn pack, where you had another Aragorn hero, and that's actually the first hero to get more than one hero card. So you had, as players of the game would say, Loragorn, to differentiate from leadership Aragorn. Now this is lore Aragorn. Aragorn has an ability that allows you to reset your threat once per game. I mentioned before the ability to pass threat as you wish between two players using Song of Elrondil and Wandering Took. Well, now imagine this. Player A and player B are both at 30 threat. Player A passes 20 threat to player B and brings their threat down to 10. And player B, who has Loragorn, drops their threat back to the starting level, which maybe is 30, or maybe it's even less. So that obviously had to get fixed. But also to go along with the Aragorn decks, you had a sword that was broken, which is a great way to power up Aragorn. And you also had ally Arwen, which goes great with Aragorn. This was the beginning of the designers of Lord of the Rings, the card game, giving players interesting deck building options in single expansions. That means putting 2 or 3 cards together that could be the core of a deck by themselves. After the Watcher in the Water came the Long Dark. I barely remember what actually happens in the quest. One of the more forgettable quests in the history of the game. Most memorable is not the fact that you had even more additions to Dwarf Swarm with Erebor Battlemaster and the Ringmail attachment, but you had Hama, who also would need to be...
What is it? Hama? I'm not sure.
Hama allowed you to reuse event cards from your discard pile, which was effectively a way to circumvent the 3-card limit for deck construction for Lord of the Rings, the card game. So it was eventually errated to prevent you from doing that and using his ability more than 3 times. Foundations of Stone was the 5th expansion in the Dwarf cycle, and it was another expansion that was centered around one hero. This was the Glorfindel pack. Now, this is by far the better Glorfindel card. Glorfindel is a hero where he only has 5 threats, so he allows you to start the game with very low threat. In fact, actually potentially triggering secrecy. If Glorfindel exhausts to commit to the quest, your threat goes up by 1, unless you have Light of Valinor. Not only that, but if you attach Asphaleth to Glorfindel and basically give him his horse to ride, you can also start dropping progress on locations in the staging area. That paired with Daeron's Rooms and Eladri's Stargazer, which made Sigil Minor an extremely powerful card until Sigil Minor was eroded. And Foundations of Stone was one of the must-have expansions if you wanted to build strong decks, which was of interest for players of Lord of the Rings, the card game at this point because the game was still pretty difficult. Foundations of Stone refers to Moria, which is where the quest takes place, and actually has one of my favorite enemies in the game, which is the Nameless Thing. Like, look at that thing. That thing's cool, the Nameless Thing. It doesn't even have a name. Like, what is that? I don't know. But that's a big Tolkien thing to refer to things as nameless things. It adds a lot of mystery to it. It's pretty cool. The ultimate expansion in the Dwarf cycle was Shadow and Flame. Shadow and Flame was the Elrond pack. Elrond was one of the most powerful heroes in the game, maybe the most powerful, especially when you attach Vilya to him. So Vilya is his ring of power. And Vilya, when attached to Elrond, which is the only character you can attach Vilya to, allows you to just drop allies into play. 5 cost, 6 cost, doesn't matter. They show up. Pair them with an Eladri's Stargazer and you know exactly what you're bringing into play as well. The quest itself was a boss battle. Shadow and Flame, you jump into the boss battle right away. Compared to earlier quests in the history of the game where you maybe faced a boss in quest stage 3 or the final quest stage. So you had a chance to build up your board state and then the enemies tended to be fairly typical, just very strong. Shadow and Flame had you facing Durin's Bane. At first glance appears to be indestructible. So if you like boss battles, this was one of the expansions for you. Shadow and Flame was released in August of 2012, which is also when the Hobbit Saga expansion was released. But before we get into the Hobbit, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the creators that were on the scene at this point in the game's history. Perhaps most notable of them was Cardboard of the Rings. By late 2012, Cardboard of the Rings had already been around for over a year. Perhaps the most prominent Lord of the Rings, a card game podcast, after all, they're at episode 237 as of the recording of this video. So they got a pretty cool logo. And of all the clever titles, I'd say Cardboard of the Rings is fairly catchy. They started in April of 2011. So Cardboard of the Rings has been there for players as almost an expansion of its own. So if you get into the game, you get to enjoy Cardboard of the Rings. In late 2012, so not that long after Shadow and Flame, Ian R. Martin released Tales from the Cards. Tales from the Cards features reviews of not just expansions, but of heroes within the expansions. Multiple reviews per expansion. Endless content to digest. My most utilized blog that started in this time frame was Hall of Beorn. In fact, earlier this week, I got worried because two of the websites I typically go to grab card art for my slides here were down. And I had to use the Hall of Beorn products guide, which came in super handy. And in early 2013 came Master of Lore, which is a blog that focuses on the lore of the Lord of the Rings, the card game. Despite all the game's shortcomings from a game design perspective, you already, again, had prominent blogs that had many years of content to come, which should illustrate how enjoyable and how deep the gameplay in this game actually can get. Promptly after the Dwarf cycle wrapped up, you had the first of the Saga expansions for the Lord of the Rings, the card game. The Hobbit expansion, the first of which was Overhill and Underhill. I'm going to review both of these boxes before jumping to the next cycle of the game, even though On the Doorstep came in the middle of that cycle because these obviously somewhat go together. The Saga expansions for Lord of the Rings, the card game, were coherent stories, which took quests that often, even though they had a story to them, felt like one-off adventures and gave you campaign mode, which allowed you to carry over cards such as found treasure for one scenario to the next. The Overhill and Underhill expansion gave you a lot more player cards to work with than Khazad-dûm did. Most notably, it gave you 5 heroes, 4 of which you actually could use outside of The Hobbit. The hero you could not use was Bilbo. Bilbo Baggins should stick out a little bit here because Bilbo Baggins was part of the Baggins sphere. No, this was not a 5th sphere added to the game, because the only cards that work for the Baggins sphere were released in the Hobbit Saga expansions. So it was a Saga-specific sphere. There's effectively a 4th hero, though, that you could put in play. So we have a lot going on with these quests. The dwarf heroes of Thorin, Nori, and Ori brought us up to, I believe, 9 dwarf heroes at this point in the game. Although I think the most interesting hero in this pack was Beorn. With 10 life and only 1 defense, but the ability to defend as much as you'd want within a turn, it was a fun hero to play with, and actually was pretty strong early on in the game. You got another Gandalf to play with. Of course, that Gandalf came into play, made a lot of things happen, and then left. Hobbit Gandalf, ideally you get this Gandalf in play early on in the game. Allows you to get a really strong boost for as long as you can handle having him with you. He cranks your threat up pretty quick as long as you do. So ideally you have Gandalf in to get a fast start to the game. Because after all, this is a deck construction game where you start with no cards in play besides your heroes. Getting a fast start is a welcome addition. Eventually, easy mode would be added to Lord of the Rings card game, and that allows you to start the game with a resource on each hero, which gave you effectively 6 resources to work with on the first turn instead of 3. Easy mode also got rid of certain cards from encounter sets, but very often when you're playing the game, especially at this stage of the game's life, if you're going to lose, you might have an idea pretty soon when you're playing because you never quite get your card engine going. All the allies in this set were dwarves. You had Fili, Kili, Bofur, and Dori. And add this to the dwarves that we've already gotten from Khazad-dûm and Dwarelf, and you understand what's going on with the Dwarf Swarm here. The 3 quests in this box were not amazing. They're very swingy quests, which was true of many quests early on in the game. That's not to say that this didn't do a good job of going through the Hobbit story. First you battle out with trolls, then you have to deal with the stone giants. You had a chance to pick up some of the treasures that Thorin's company pick up during the Hobbit story, and you eventually create a split quest situation where Bilbo has a riddle match with Gollum. On the Doorstep picks up where Overhill and Underhill left off, with a new Bilbo, a slightly more well-rounded Bilbo, another Baggins sphere card, and even more dwarves. Between Balin, Owen, and Bombur, you had 11 total dwarf heroes in the game. And if you include all of the dwarf allies of these 2 sets, you now had the 13 dwarves, in addition to Bilbo, that were part of Thorin's company. On the Doorstep also featured Bard the Bowman, who is such a strong ranged character that I always refer to him as Bard the Bomber. You got the Black Arrow and other attachments that make ranged characters even more effective. The quests for this set fight the spiders in Mirkwood, dealing with Smaug inside the mountain, and then the Battle of 5 Armies. Not the Battle of the 5 Armies, the Battle of 5 Armies. If you wanted to see what happened when Smaug got pissed off and went to go blow up Lake Town, where he would though eventually meet his demise, you had a Gen Con expansion, the second Gen Con expansion in the history of the game. The Battle of Lake Town. The first Gen Con expansion, the Massing of Osgiliath, was almost and arguably the most difficult quest in the game until the Battle of Lake Town was released. It had you actually fighting Smaug. This quest really goes with the Hobbit quests, giving you a 7-quest story to play out. On the Doorstep was released in February of 2013. 2013 would feature the next cycle of the game, but also would see the emergence of even more content creators that helped enhance the experience for Lord of the Rings the card game players. You had the first content from the Grey Company podcast, which, while not quite as prolific as Cardboard of the Rings, had 69 episodes through 2019. And I would be remiss not to mention the 10th Nazgul.
That is my jam.
Which is the combo of Mitch from Cardboard of the Rings and Matthew from the Grey Company, which put together progression series videos through the first several cycles of the game. 10th Nazgul is notable for showing how to use the Octagon software if you wanted to play the Lord of the card game on your computer. Also makes a great drinking game if you drink every time one of them says, be that as it may. The next Deluxe expansion was the Heirs of Numenor, which refers to Gondor. This set kicked off the cycle of 2013, which was the Against the Shadow cycle. Now, Heirs of Numenor is another mixed bag. You see, you got some cool heroes and cool player cards here. You had Leadership Boromir as a hero, and you had Baragond. You notice Baragond here has a number 4 on the defense side. I'll tell you what, that was a welcome addition. Getting some sort of a hero that has not only 4 defense, but also 4 health, and could take attachments easily. Baragond was immediately one of the best heroes in the game. When I first played the game, I played progression style. So when I was working through, I remember reading online about everyone using Baragond at the time, and I was like, man, I really wish I had Baragond here, but I wasn't allowing myself to do it. I wanted to play pure progression style. The thing with Heirs of Numenor is the quests. I've already mentioned many times how hard this game was. In the Heirs of Numenor quest, it was brutal. You had Peril of Pelargir as the first quest in the game, which was hard, but not table-flipping difficult. But then Into Athelion and the Siege of Caer Andros were so hard that a lot of people, I believe, just left the game at this point.
I'm not playing anymore.
After going from Dwarf Swarm, and then when they finally got out of Dwarf Swarm, they just get stomped by these ridiculous quests. I get it.
I'm out.
But if you can look past that difficulty, they did add some interesting mechanics to the game that would be used a lot later. Archery keyword, which dealt direct damage to your characters, which made it harder to build up a massive army of dwarves or otherwise, and forced players to play differently than a lot of the power decks of the time would play. But also added different quest types. See, most quests would use willpower as the trait you use to advance in a quest. Battle quests require to use your attack value. Willpower is easily the most important trait for characters in the game to this point, so having some quests that used attack as the trait you actually quest with immediately made other characters more valuable. The siege keyword was you would use your defense trait to quest. So these are great ways to add theme and immersion, even if not everyone got to fully experience it because they focused on how freaking difficult these things were. If Khazad-dûm and Dwarf is the high school phase for Lord of the Rings, the card game, and maybe The Hobbit is a year of junior college to get your grades up, Heirs of Numenor and Against the Shadow was going off to college, and talk about making dramatic decisions on a whim here. The first expansion, Against the Shadow, might be the most infamous individual quest expansion. Players now had a handful of deck options. They could play Dwarf Swarm, they could play Rohan decks, they could play Secrecy decks if they really wanted it to be difficult. And perhaps because the expansion was so dispersed and where you had to buy expansions of expansions, they wanted to make it easy to build a deck. So they released the Steward's Fear, which was a deck
in a box,
and it was the Outlands deck in one box.
In a box.
You had here Lewin the Fair, who starts off, he looks kind of weak, but
Take a look inside.
You had 4 allies that would go into play, where it was a simple mechanic. The more allies of that type are in play, the more they buff the traits of all of the Outlands characters out there. You would have something like, you could potentially have double-digit characters in play that have 2, 3, or 4 for their traits for willpower, attack, defense, and health. The Steward's Fear is an interesting quest because you're going to face one of 3 big bads in the quest, but Steward's Fear is just known for being the Outlands deck. Let's say it was a little bit too much. This is the last time they're steadily beating you up with dwarves and then stomping the player after going dwarves, 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 followed by Outlands. The designer's kind of dialed it back a little bit with getting too cute with making decks, with making individual decks in a box.
In a box.
The next expansion was the Druidon Forest. And the Druidon Forest, this is where more options for secrecy decks. Merlond is a great hero for dropping your initial threat level. If you also pair it with Monosphere decks. So the Monosphere deck concept would give you bonuses if all three of your heroes were from the same sphere. Having all three heroes from the same sphere was another thing that was largely missing from the early years of the game. Just like decks that featured less than 3 heroes, having decks that featured 3 heroes from the same sphere was fairly rare. So designers directly programmed benefits for Monosphere decks right into some of the expansions and Against the Shadow. The Druidon Forest was also interesting because of the enemies fought some woes as you went through the Druidon Forest, which are characters that are part of Middle-earth and weren't mentioned in the Lord of the Rings movies. So it did make you feel like you were going deeper into Middle-earth compared to the earliest sets of the game. The Against the Shadow cycle had you going in and around Gondor accomplishing missions, which was the first time the game actually set you on quests that were not very similar to established lore. In Khazad-dûm, you went into Moria and then, you kind of got close to Durnsbane and you left. They named Durnsbane. In the Dwarf cycle, you did the same thing, and you even hit, Caradhras and Caradhras. I'm going to pronounce it right. And the Watcher in the Water on the way into Moria, and then you did the same thing in Moria again. The Shadows of Mirkwood cycle follows the story of the Hunt for Gollum, which is an actual story, which some of you may know there is a Hunt for Gollum movie coming out, I think, in 2026. It's one of the more notable stories that has yet to be covered on the big screen for Lord of the Rings. And speaking of going in and around Gondor, Encounter at Amon Dîn is actually pretty cool because if you look at maps of Middle-earth, sometimes it actually shows Amon Dîn. They're like, hey, played a quest around there. Encounter at Amon Dîn had Pippin as a hero, which was also well-timed because the Lord of the Rings saga, where you're about to get a lot more hobbits, was just around the corner. Encounter at Amon Dîn had a character introduced. You had Lord Alcaron as an objective ally. Lord Alcaron was one of the first characters that wasn't a hero card that was really developed during the course of Lord of the Rings, the card game, if you follow the stories of the expansions. Encounter at Amon Dîn also leaned a little bit into Ranger decks and some of the first hints of trap decks.
1, 2.
One of my favorite deck ideas, even if they're definitely not one of the strongest decks in the game. Assault on Osgiliath busted out Faramir as a hero, which seemed a little bit overdue. It also gave you a little bit more Outlands cards, if that wasn't already strong enough. The Palantir was well-themed, in my opinion, because it was a card that lets you gamble a little bit. The more you used it, the stronger you get, but the more you raise your threat, which is kind of like how the Palantir kind of works. The Blood of Gondor, which had maybe some of the best cover art of any of the expansions with that, I think it's a Black Numenorian, was most notable for hero Caldara. I mentioned before that the designers wised up a little bit after the Steward's Fear. The reason why I said a little bit is because Caldara decks are arguably the strongest decks in the game. It's not a deck in a box the same way Outlands works. Caldara leaves play and allows you to put 1 spirit ally into play for each other spirit hero you control. So if you went mono spirit, discarding Caldara gives you 2 spirit allies, potentially very strong spirit allies. And eventually you would get Prince Imrahil as a spirit ally, who's a card that generated resources like a hero. Caldara decks were strong in the beginning, then got very strong. Caldara would also get an errata to prevent Caldara from re-entering play with Fortune and Feint and triggering her ability again, which was another endless loop and was kind of silly. Then the final expansion of Against the Shadow was the Morgul Veil. Theoden as a hero was quite the awesome card here, partially because Theoden's one of my favorite characters from the movies, but also he's a strong card and he was someone who could retroactively make some of your Rohan decks stronger. Ered Nimra's Prospector seemed like a totally unnecessary additional dwarf, but you got another dwarf here. But I mostly remember the Morgul Veil for being really, really difficult solo. This is the quest that I tried the most times before defeating solo. More than Masking on Osgiliath, more than any of the Heirs of Numenor quests. Because Murzog, that orc captain over there to the right, starts quests in play, and if you don't get rid of him quickly, it's kind of a hill troll situation. The Gen Con expansion at the end of the Against the Shadow cycle was the Stone of Erech, which this time was not another step up in difficulty. It was kind of a break, which was honestly kind of nice. Falderafin, who basically was the Middle-earth version of a kid who just kind of got lost. It was a fun quest that used daytime, midnight, and dusk mechanics that changed how encounter cards actually function. If you're new to Lord of the Rings, the card game, and you're shopping around for cards to buy, you might not have recognized a lot of the sets that I've talked through in this video or in part 3 of my Lord of the Rings card game series,
the greatest modern card game.
There's a reason for that. Early on in the game's history, the scenario design and the card design was sloppier than it was several years into the game's life. Thus, when sets were repackaged for sale in the 2020s, not everything got repackaged. The Hobbit Saga expansions were not repackaged. The core set was repackaged, but none of the sets here were repackaged. Instead, what they did was they took some of the best cards from these sets and they put them into the starter decks that you can buy. So we're looking here, this is in chronological order by cycle. So first you have the core set over there to the left, followed by Khazad-dûm, and implied there is Khazad-dûm and the Dwarf Elf cycle. And the other sets we talked about today, the Hobbit Saga expansions and Heirs of Numenor. What I listed here is the number of cards from each cycle that are featured in the starter decks. The core set features 27, most of which are just bringing up to 3 copies of a lot of cards in the core set. I think 16 of the 27 were cards from the core set. Khazad-dûm featured 17 cards that moved into starter decks. Hobbit expansions featured 11, and Heirs of Numenor 21. It wasn't until the Lord of the Rings saga began where the design of Lord of the Rings, the card game expansions, was so strong that it was worth repackaging, which is actually a very good thing, because if the beginning of the Lord of the Rings saga expansion weren't well designed, and it's a really good series of quests and good cards, it would be unfortunate to have the repackaged Lord of the Rings saga either be incomplete or be kind of shaky from the get-go. Even though Voice of Isengard didn't get a repackaged expansion, I really consider the Black Riders as the coming-of-age set for Lord of the Rings, the card game. Now, having finished school...
When I graduated first grade, all my father did was tell me to get a job.
It was time for the game to grow up. And as the game grew up, more friends would be had. We're not done talking about content creators here. You had the blog Darkling Door, which came into being around the time when you had enough cards available in the Lord of the Rings the card game where you could have powerful decks that had a chance to complete scenarios, and they were also thematic. Darkling Door I also appreciate for the Tales of Years campaign, which is a way to actually design a campaign out of all the quests in the game. You had more blogs like Vision of the Palantir. You had the emergence of C-Stan, who's not just famous for his Expecting Mischief blog, but being one of the heroes of content creators for the game. While I was compiling materials to film this video, RingsDB, which is an amazing deck building website that I spent hours on when rocking my current 5-year-old to sleep when he was an infant, was down. C-Stan had posted on the Lord of the Rings the card game subreddit saying that the website was down and he was working to get it up. It is 2025. The game is 14 years old at this point, and he's working tirelessly to get a website back up and running. And he got it up and running. In fact, I guess I can't really call it RingsDB anymore. IP address 104.131.0.165. Excellent fan-made website. He's also, as I understand, responsible for Dragon Cards and is the lead designer in the A Long Expected Party fan expansions that we will eventually cover in this series. The Mike Vincent YouTube series on Lord of the Rings the card game, circa 2014, was one of the things that inspired me to make YouTube videos in the first place. Because after all, if you look at my channel, one of the first videos I made was top 10 heroes of the core set, because I thought that more people in addition to Mike Vincent should be making lists like that. Card Talk Dave came online in 2018. To this point, he has put out 630 videos. The man is a machine. And perhaps the greatest YouTube video in the history of the game wasn't released until 2022. The Game Locker's How to Play video, which is actually a little bit different from the Mike Vincent videos, was so good that I didn't see much of a point for doing a How to Play video myself, because that's kind of, you can't do better than that video. It was really well done. In part 5 of this series, the game has entered its prime. We're going to go over what that prime was like. Some of the different sets, the places they would take you in Middle-earth, what it was like to play a game where you had deck construction options that were both thematic and effective. And we'll also talk a little bit more about the other alternatives that were starting to pop up, and why you might choose to play Lord of the card game over, say, Arkham Horror the card game, or perhaps the video game adaptation of Lord of the Rings the card game.
Hi, Phil Swift here for
the Lord of the Rings the card game,
the super strong
customizable card game
that can instantly patch, bond, seal, and repair.
LOTR LCG
is no ordinary
card game. Its variety of quests and mechanisms
virtually welds itself
to your table
instantly,
having you play it again. Formulaic games can cause major headaches, but LOTR LCG
grips on tight and bonds instantly. Plus,
the Lord of the Rings the card game's core mechanism
is so strong it even
works on your wallet.
Not all tabletop games get to experience their prime. What begin as boxes full of potential meet their demise as boxes full of regret. And to find games that suffered that fate, you need not look far. In the Fantasy Flight Games catalog alone. For every Lord of the Rings card game, a Lord of the Rings Journeys in Middle-earth. For every Descent Journeys in the Dark, you will get a Battle Lore 2nd edition. But while some games were saying,
I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody.
The Lord of the Rings card game was busy becoming the greatest modern card game. I'm Jackson Warfield, and today we're going to look back on the prime that the Lord of the Rings card game had, which in my mind began in late 2013 with the release of the Black Riders Saga expansion and lasted until 2018. Like Uncle Rico, we're going to relive the time when you committed so many characters to the quest that you could have punted an enemy a quarter mile. So get huddled under a tree root, grab a meat fork, because today for 11sies, we're tasting some prime rings.
A day may come when the courage of men fails, but it is not this day. This day we fight!
If you'd like to support the channel, I now have product affiliate links in the description. So if you want to get in the Lord of the Rings card game or expand your collection, right there. As I mentioned, the prime of the Lord of the Rings card game begins with the release of the Black Riders. September 2013's release was the beginning of the Lord of the Rings saga, where the game designers took what they learned with the Hobbit saga and adapted it to the Lord of the Rings story. Obviously, the Lord of the Rings is the main story of the Lord of the Rings, so this was a big deal, and they did a good job with it. The quests of the Black Riders were A Shadow of the Past, A Knife in the Dark, and Flight to the Ford. These quests did a good job of replicating what the Fellowship of the Ring story was like. The game didn't just artistically evoke the lore of Lord of the Rings, it did it mechanically as well, as you were playing with Hobbit heroes, and this box was the absolute best box for getting started with Hobbit decks. The box featured the Hobbits we know and love from the Lord of the Rings movies as its heroes. Frodo Baggins, Sam Gamgee, Merry, Pippin, and Fatty Bolger, some of the most famous characters of Lord of the Rings. Frodo was the Fellowship Sphere hero. So with the Black Riders, you did not have the Baggins Sphere, although I guess in theory they could have gone with the Baggins Sphere because Frodo is Frodo Baggins, but the orange sphere here is the Fellowship Sphere. The Fellowship Sphere card of the Black Riders was the Fellowship of the Ring, which was a necessarily strong card, and all of the Frodo characters had a similar ability where you exhausted the One Ring card, that's an objective card, and spent one of the resources from Frodo. And for this Frodo, for doing so, you got to cancel the effects of an encounter card revealed by the encounter deck. If you wanted to build Hobbit decks and not necessarily play them within the Lord of the Rings campaign, Sam Gamgee, Merry, and Pippin were all solid cards. Honestly, all solid cards. Fatty Bolger, a little bit less so. Fatty Bolger, I guess, was a bit of a throw-in to get them up to 4 non-Fellowship Sphere heroes. But these Hobbits all had their specialties. Sam Gamgee went very well with Bill the Pony. Merry was your Hobbit attacker, and you would often equip him with the Dagger of Westerness. Pippin enhanced your ability to play Hobbit decks because Hobbit often would go well with Secrecy decks, where you would get bonuses for keeping your threat below 20. By increasing the engagement cost of the enemies that you're dealing with, you would avoid having to engage enemies when you're playing through the quest. This was a big deal, and this actually fits very thematically with the Fellowship of the Ring, as the Hobbits spent most of the time avoiding the Nazgul as opposed to fighting them directly. Because the Black Riders was such a good box, it was a very popular one. It would often be the box recommended for new players after they got the core set. As a result, the first boons you got to choose from, Mr. Underhill and Gildor and Glorian, amounted to a famous choice. Most people would go with Mr. Underhill as their boon of preference, even though Gildor's card is very strong. For those not familiar with the books of Lord of the Rings, Gildor and Glorian is actually featured early on in the Fellowship of the Ring, as the hobbits would pass by a troop of elves early on in their journey. Fans of the book would also appreciate that about a year after the release of the Black Riders, the Gen Con and Fellowship expansions for the game would add to the Lord of the Rings saga. You had the Old Forest, which is the Gen Con expansion, and Fog on the Barrow Downs, which is the Fellowship expansion. These are areas of the Fellowship of the Ring story that were not heavily explored, if at all, in the movies, but were actually significant parts of the book. Actually, a lot happens in Fellowship of the Ring that is not mentioned in the movies. The Old Forest is where Tom Bombadil comes into play. Again, not in the movies. The Old Forest will remind movie viewers, though, of Fangorn, as the Huorns, such as Old Man Willow, were somewhat of living trees. Even though Old Man Willow is not a Huorn enemy, that's kind of what they are. Fog on the Barrow Downs is actually a fairly intense area of the story, where the hobbits go past the Barrow Downs, which is an area, effectively graves, where you had Barrow Wights, which are what the guy on the cover is there, popping out to fight you. Now, Tom Bombadil comes to save the day in the books, and obviously going through the campaign there. The question is whether or not you're able to use him to do the same effect. The reason why these were optional quests in the campaign, see how their Lord of the Rings parts are 1.1 and 1.2, is because actually a month before these were released, you had the second saga expansion for the Lord of the Rings in The Road Darkens, which covers the rest of the Fellowship of the Ring book and movie. Specific timing of the ending of Fellowship of the Ring versus beginning of Two Towers notwithstanding. This would be the final time the card game ventured through that same area of the Watcher in the Water at the Gates of Moria, followed by a fight with the Balrog, Durin's Bane. Well, not quite as famous as the Black Riders, and it wouldn't be because it's the sequel to the Black Riders. The Road Darkens was also a very solid box. They had another Frodo Baggins hero, so we're 2 for 2 on Frodo Baggins heroes so far in the Fellowship sphere. This Frodo used the ring to survive attacks as opposed to avoiding counterattacks, which is actually also thematic with where they were in the story. Unlike the Black Riders, the Road Darkens only came with one hero. That was Gandalf. And Gandalf would go down as being the highest threat cost hero in any expansion for Lord of the Rings, the card game, and he earns it. When you play with Gandalf, you play with the top card of your deck face up. He is an excellent card to pair with cards like Elrond, who can play the top card of the deck for free once he gets Vilya. A Gandalf and Elrond deck will have a starting threat number of 27, even though it only uses 2 heroes, but that still is a strong deck, all things considered. There's one of the few times in the game's life where you would consider going with less than 3 heroes because just the third hero would send your threat up almost up to 40, depending on who you pick. The Road Darkens came with several strong allies. Galadriel and Elrond were strong, but then would also leave play after a turn, similar to Corset Gandalf. Boromir and Bilbo Baggins were also strong, but would stick around, which is a reminder that I should say that Gandalf had to be strong, because otherwise no one was going to use Gandalf as a card, because the Gandalf ally from the Corset is one of the strongest cards in the game, and if you had Hero Gandalf, you would never be able to play Ally Gandalf, as he's a unique character. Gandalf also has a number of attachment cards, such as Gandalf's Staff, and what's effectively his card is Wizard Pipe. They help set up getting that top card of your deck and get it into play. To list at this point, now you have Aragorn decks, Gandalf decks, Glorfindel and Elrond somewhat have their own decks. There wouldn't be many characters that got their own entire archetypes, but Gandalf was one of them. And even if his decks weren't the most effective in the history of the game, they were fun to play. The Lord of the Rings saga wasn't the only new trend starting at the end of 2013. Actually, a month earlier, in August of 2013, the first Nightmare decks were released. Lord of the Rings, the card game, always had a mix of players. You had players that wanted more of a thematic experience, that were going to spend a little bit of time in deck construction, but weren't the types of players that would get enjoyment from very heavy, very complex and intense deck construction for difficult quests. On the other side of the coin, you did have players that wanted as much of a challenge as possible. Nightmare decks were for those players. We see here what the Nightmare decks did was make some of the existing quests, which are already, in some cases, a challenge, and make them even more of a challenge. But it wasn't just that. You see, Nightmare decks gave the designers a chance to fix arguably broken quests from the past. The Hills of Emmamuil, for example, was one of the least fun quests in the game's history with the way it used locations, and the Nightmare deck was a chance to somewhat fix that. Create a card, a tunneling nameless thing, which actually looked like some of the giant creatures from the Hobbit movies. One of the best examples of this was the conflict at the Carrack. As popular as that expansion was, once you played the quest a few times, you pretty much had that quest figured out. You knew what order you had to attack the different trolls, and it no longer became a challenge. The Nightmare deck allowed the designers to remake that quest and make it a little bit more exciting so you could go back and have an interesting challenge even after beating it the first and second time. Nightmare decks would persist throughout the prime of the game, and the last Nightmare decks would end up being released around the time the prime ended, which was in 2018. Nightmare decks were tended to be released 2 years after the initial release of the various expansions. So not all expansions got Nightmare decks. The last expansions to get the Nightmare deck treatment were the Dream Chaser cycle expansions, the Sea of Corsairs being the last one in 2018. We'll obviously get to the Grey Havens and the Dream Chaser cycle later on in this video. This is a busy time for Lord of the Rings, the card game, because in the middle of the Saga expansion, in the middle of the green boxes of the Saga expansion, that is the Fellowship of the Ring boxes, you had the start of the 2014 cycle, which was the Voice of Isengard Deluxe expansion and the following Ringmaker cycle. The Voice of Isengard's quests were the Fords of Isen to catch an orc, where you go to catch the orc Mugosh, and into Fangorn. So you're in and around Isengard, Fangorn Forest, and Northern Rohan. You're also spending a lot of time in Dunland, which is an area not heavily touched on in the movies, but is a bit to the northwest of Isengard and Rohan. That's where the Dunland tribesmen that you see here were the main enemies. It was an interesting variety. It was a type of enemy you not see of much before. The Ringmaker refers to Celebrimbor, who at the time was not known for being a character in Rings of Power, as that show wouldn't be released for another 8 or 9 years. But what did come out in 2014 was the Shadow of Mordor video game, which also featured Celebrimbor fairly heavily. Quick controversial take. I think the Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War video games take place in a similar space as Lord of the Rings, the card game, as non-canonical, but not in violation of the main canon of Middle-earth and of Tolkien's universe. I think you could have made a Talion card, Talion being the protagonist of the Shadow of Mordor video game, and put him in Lord of the Rings, the card game, and it wouldn't have been jarring at all. I actually think that would have been kind of cool. Obviously, that never happened, and some people might be just covering their ears with that suggestion, but that's my take. One of my favorite quests from this series was the Three Trials, which features some pretty cool enemies: the Boar's Guardian, the Raven's Guardian, and the Wolf's Guardian. Seem to be straight out of the game Blood Rage, almost. I don't think there's a Boar clan there, but I think you do have Wolf and Raven. The main quest mechanic that was developed in the Ringmaker cycle was the timed mechanic. This was a time when the designers were realizing ways that the game itself had flaws or loopholes to playing the game. For example, the fact that you did not typically have a hand limit in any scenarios meant that you could have 20 cards in your hand. You feel cheap doing that as a player, and it's not that fun to have to choose between 20 cards. It feels like the game's a little bit broken. So the designers would release quests that would enforce hand limits. The timed mechanic, which was first seen in the Voice of Isengard and Ringmaker cycle, at least first seen used heavily, forced you to move forward in quests after only a handful of turns, as a notable strategy at the time was to intentionally go slowly in quests, thus building up a larger board state, biding your time to build up a strong team before you entered the final phases of quests, which was a little bit out of the spirit of the game, and thus the designers didn't want to encourage that. While a time mechanic was a little bit on the nose at the time, it was the first instance of this mechanic which would come back later in the game and was a way to both add theme and control to the actual scenarios of the game. As you can see from the heroes of the Voice of Isengard and the Ringmaker cycle, Rohan got some additional firepower here. You had Éomer and Grima and Erkenbrand later on. Grima was perhaps the most interesting hero of this cycle, as he was an Isengard hero, first of all, so he's really thought of as more of an Isengard hero than Rohan. This is one of the examples of where you're playing with what's clearly a bad guy from the story. This is like Denethor, but even more so. So it was a little bit strange, a lot of people playing with Grima, and some people may not have wanted to play with Grima simply because
I told you to take the wizard's staff!
he was revealed to be a villain within the story of the Two Towers. But Grima was a card to use if you wanted to lean into one of the new player card mechanics, which was the Doomed mechanic. This is a mechanic where you could increase your threat as a way to decrease the cost to play cards. The Saruman ally was the best example of a card that did this. So you see, Saruman was extremely powerful and only cost 3 resources again to play, but at Doomed 3, he would increase everyone's threat by 3 when he entered play. The Doomed mechanic being on player cards is one of my favorite thematic implementations of the game, whereas, yeah, you could use Saruman and Grima as quote-unquote good guys, but there is a price to doing so, and you could argue that it's a bit of a trap and you're going to hit your 50 threat marker sooner and actually lose as a way of them almost turning on you. This cycle also had the vast majority of the Sylvan cards that would eventually be in the Elves of Lorien expansion. You had Celeborn, Haldir, and Galadriel. Celeborn and Haldir are the Sylvan Elves. Galadriel is a Noldor elf, and Noldor cards would have to wait another cycle or 2 before that archetype got fully built out. But the Sylvan deck was built around allies entering play and leaving play. and often doing so by direct card effect and not necessarily by spending resources. At the very least, these cards would often get bonuses on the turn they entered play, so you got big bonuses when the elves would show up, and often they would just leave, which is also kind of a thing that elves do. Idrain and Mablung didn't fit into the main archetypes of this cycle, but will fit very well with the cards that came out with the Lost Realm and the Angmar Awakened cycle, which we will get to when we get to the 2015. But before we do that, I want to first mention this was also the first time we saw end cards. Treebeard was an ally that could pay for end cards, and the Booming Ent here is one of the first Ent allies that was released for the game. Ents would enter play exhausted, but to make up for that, they would be very powerful, which makes sense given how slow Ents are.
Takes a long time to say anything in all Entish.
This wouldn't be the last of the Ents, far from it, as in April of 2015, we would see the next installment of the Lord of the Rings saga, the Two Towers expansions of the Treason of Sauron and the Land of Shadow. The narrative of the Two Towers splits into two main stories. You have the Treason of Sauron side, where you have the three hunters, Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas, and going through their adventures through Rohan and helping fight Isengard.
Legolas, what's your elf eye see? The Uruks turn northeast.
Meanwhile, Frodo, Sam, and Gollum will be continuing the quest to destroy the ring. Saying Gollum was on that particular aspect of the quest might not be totally true, but these expansions, narratively speaking, were taking place at the same time. For the Treason of Saruman, the quest first took you through Isengard as Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas were first tracking the Uruk-hai through Rohan, eventually bringing them to Edoras, where they would meet Theoden and defend Helm's Deep from the invading army of Isengard. Upon victory, he moved off to Isengard to then take down Orthanc and Saruman with the help of the Ents. I appreciate the fact that the fortress here was referred to as the Hornburg, because that's actually what the fortress is called. Saruman also functioned as somewhat of a boss battle. All the saga expansions had at least one boss-type character you had to fight. In the Black Riders, it was the Witch King at Weathertop. In the Road Darkens, you had Durin's Bane, or the Balrog, and the Watcher in the Water. In the Treason of Saruman, it's basically Saruman. Now, you saw the beginning of three Hunters decks here. You had Gimli and Legolas released as allies. They're obviously already released as heroes in the core set, but they were fairly effective here as allies as well. In fact, at 4 cost, they actually provide good values for 4 cost. You can tell that the designers wanted you to use Gimli and Legolas while you could. The Spirit Theoden hero would allow you to get Rohan allies into play quickly, which immediately made Rohan decks more effective. There was a lot of Rohan going on at the time here, with Voice of Isengard wrapping up and then this saga expansion coming out. But also got Hero Treebeard. So we just got Ally Treebeard less than a year before this. But Treebeard was a very strong hero that could make himself stronger by damaging himself, which isn't that big of a deal because a lot of Ent allies were very good at healing. This is also the first Fellowship Sphere hero that was not Frodo Baggins, as we got the first of the Fellowship Aragorn cards. And this Aragorn readied heroes like Corset Aragorn does, but you're doing so with Fellowship resources, which you really can't use to spend for many other cards, relatively speaking. The Land of Shadow, despite taking place concurrently with Treason of Saruman, was released 7 months later, so in November of 2015. This expansion would show Frodo, Sam, and Gollum first pass through the Dead Marshes, which they probably would have named that quest the Dead Marshes, if not for the fact that they already used that name for a quest. They would then cross paths with Faragorn's company.
I did 2 takes of that, and apparently I said Faragorn both times. It's Faramir. This is a long video.
And the journey to the Crossroads, followed by Shelob's Lair, who was the boss character for this expansion. Shelob, that is. You started to see some enemies from Harad, which is another nice aspect of variety. Haradrim enemies have a bit of an Arabian feel to them, which was obviously not an aesthetic applied to any enemies in the game so far. I can't totally look past the fact that that Smeagol Objective Ally card is very, very ugly. That's a strange looking Smeagol. Fellowship Frodo got to use Fellowship resources and exhaust the One Ring to power himself up here, which again is more of what he was doing in this phase of the story. The heroes of this box were Faramir and Damrod. Faramir and Damrod, while Gondor heroes did really fit into traditional Gondor decks like we've seen with the Heirs of Numenor, they leaned more into Ranger decks, which went hand in hand with trap decks. This is also a time where you were better off by buying as many expansions as possible. Just for example, if you wanted Skinbark to go with your Ents, you couldn't just get the Voice of Isengard expansions and the Treason of Saruman for that. You also needed to get the Land of Shadow. While a lot of these expansions had themes and main archetypes that they went for and main traits that they would help emphasize, there was always a mix of cards in each expansion of Lord of the Rings at this point. It was very common to have expansions have, say, one dwarf card or one end card. If you want to make your dwarf decks as strong as possible, you need to buy that expansion for it. It might be silly to buy a $15 to $20 expansion for one card, or in some cases $30 expansions for the deluxe boxes. But like I mentioned in the earlier parts of this series, the Lord of the Rings card game was at its best if you had a lot of expansions, and this is partly why. Because as you added expansions to your collection, all deck types got stronger and gave you more and more options. It felt like exponential options for deck construction as each of these archetypes got built out gradually. At the same time of the release of the Treason of Saruman, you had the beginning of the 2015 cycle for Lord of the Rings, the card game. This was the Lost Realm and the Angmar Awakened cycle. For those unfamiliar, Angmar is the region to the north of Middle-earth, and the Witch King of Angmar, one of the big bads in the Lord of the Rings story, especially at the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and Weathertop for that matter, is from Angmar. It was perhaps the first truly unexplored area of Middle-earth that Lord of the Rings the card game would delve into. Between the saga expansions and the fact that the first few cycles of the game took place in areas very familiar to fans of the Lord of the Rings movies, Voice of Isengard, for example, is all territory you might recognize. Sure, Dunland was a little bit to the north of Isengard. Exploring Dunland, you get less of a feel for the area, more just a different variety of enemies, right, seemingly in and around Rohan. Angmar, you got new types of enemies, but you also got locations that fit the theme and felt different enough from the main Lord of the Rings story that you felt like you were someplace new. The closest you get to Angmar in the main Lord of the Rings story is at Weathertop. Or if you got the fog on the Barrow Downs, that's what you got to think about for Angmar here. Angmar actually borders Arnor, which is the northern area of men that fell about 1,500 years before the time of the Lord of the Rings. So you're talking about a lot of whites and spectral, ghostly bad guys here. The quests of this cycle were difficult, but it was still a good story, and there's a reason why this was the first of the deluxe expansions and following cycles to get repackaged when the game was revived in 2022. You had objective allies like Iarion and Amarthiel. Amarthiel would follow the arc of first becoming an objective ally and eventually becoming a hero. My personal pick for my favorite expansion art is the Battle of Carn Dûm, with that art for Thardir standing on a field, on a barren field. Also happens to be one of the most difficult quests in the history of the game. So if you successfully beat that guy, you have accomplished something significant. One of my favorite quests to play, however, was actually Escape from Mount Graham, which in my opinion was an improved version of the rescue someone from the dungeons type of quest you saw with Escape from Dol Guldur in the core set. Escape from Mount Graham, you actually start with one hero, and you have to find your other heroes as you escape from the titular Mount Graham, which felt very different from other quests and is a fun, very thematic thing to add into a game. And it was nice at this point in the game's history, the designers knew how to design a quest like that. As far as player cards are concerned, this was where you started to see the Dunedain archetype. The Lost Realm featured Halbarad and Aragorn. Tactics Aragorn, that is. And that's, if you count Fellowship Aragorn, that's 4 different Aragorn cards. Although Frodo, technically, I think also had 4 heroes at this point. 3 of them, though, were Fellowship. Here you had Fellowship Aragorn, Tactics Aragorn, Lore Aragorn, and Core Set Leadership Aragorn. So Aragorn was leading in the most versions of the same hero department. The Dunedain archetype was all about engaging enemies, which fits the theme of Dunedain Rangers defending the peaceful areas in Eriador and what used to be Arnor, such as Hobbiton. You wonder how Hobbiton's able to be so peaceful? It's because these guys are taking on the enemies willingly. A few new mechanics were also revealed in this cycle. First was the mechanic of side quests. So these were player cards, and you had some encounter cards that were side quests as well. You could explore them instead of the main quest, and if you did so, you got certain bonuses. So it has a bit of that RPG type feel where you could power yourself up by going on a side quest. But unlike RPGs, when you're playing Lord of the Rings, a card game, you don't have forever to go do that. So you don't end up overpowered. You're definitely inflicting a cost by taking a turn away from the main quest, but they're very often worth it and are very fun cards. Gather Information was the first player card side quest, and side quests were something that you would see throughout the rest of the game's life. Another fun new mechanic was the idea of encounter style allies. So Ranger of the North was a card that if you played Ranger Summons, you got to put into the encounter deck. So you would actually get these guys popping out of the encounter deck. So this is the Ranger of the North is a quite strong card. You only have to pay 1 resource for it, but you don't get to control when he shows up. But then he might come and save the day just when you need him, which is an awesome effect. Ton of fun. The rest of the heroes of the Angmar Awakened cycle were pulling from a variety of different archetypes. You got Mary as another version of Mary for your Hobbit decks. Dory the Dwarf. Amarthiel as another Dunedain hero. Rasil the Sylvan hero is kind of in a category by her own. You see, Rasil would use cards that go into the victory display. It was something that very specific to Rasil, and as a result you had Rasil decks were designed to get cards in the victory display, not just encounter cards. If you had an encounter card that had a victory number on it, that means when you defeated that character, you would put it in the victory display, and it wouldn't go back and get reshuffled in the encounter deck. That is something reserved for unique and big bad type of enemies. But with Rasil decks, you're able to get player cards into the victory display as well. I haven't played too much with Rasil decks. If you thought Sylvan decks were a little bit counterintuitive in how they operate, where you get bonuses just for dropping cards in and out of play, Rasil decks are going to feel very strange to you. You also had Eristor and Arwen, the Noldor heroes. Eristor and Arwen were some of the most prominent early cards of the Noldor archetype, which we'll talk about more with the Grey Havens and the Dream Chaser cycle. What you need to know now, Noldor was more about discarding cards and drawing cards, where Sylvan was more about the cards entering play and leaving play. So similar, both types of elves, but different in a few important ways. Before we move on, just one more mention here is Sword Thane. I like any cards that allow you to potentially get extra heroes in play. Sword Thane was one of the first ways you can actually do that. The 2015 Gen Con and Fellowship expansion packs were the last of the just regular old, here's another cool quest that you can go do, print-on-demand expansions. The Ruins of Belegost takes place in the Blue Mountains, which is to the west of Middle-earth. It was actually a nice precursor to the Greyhaven cycle, which takes place to the west. In this quest, you're actually hunting a dragon from Thangorodrim, which for those that read the Silmarillion know that it's a prominent mountain in the history of Middle-earth. That's one of the favorite things that the Lord of the Card Game does, is when it's able to evoke things from earlier ages of Middle-earth in ways that they would be relevant in the Third Age. So I really appreciate those mentioned. The Murder at the Prancing Pony was an interesting quest type because you're trying to guess who the murderer is. There's also a bit of a difficult quest, and there's also a bit of a one-off adventure like the Ruins of Belegost. In February 2016, we got the Grey Havens, which was the beginning of the Dream Chaser cycle. In the Grey Havens, players actually got to board ships in a card game. That's right. You got ships such as the Dream Chaser, and one of the mechanics you had to manage was the sailing of your ship. Your ship could be on course or off course, and whether or not it is tracked by that compass-looking card that you see there. Thematically, the cycle took you onto the seas, the ocean of Belgair. Belgair, also known as the Great Sea, or the Sundering Seas, or the Western Sea. And you actually got to sail around the sunken ruins of Numenor, which in the Second Age of Middle-earth was plunged into the sea by Eru Ilúvatar. Such a cool way to take full advantage of the Middle-earth theme. Obviously, nothing like that happens in any Middle-earth canon, but it absolutely could happen. The entire continent of Beleriand is kind of under the water too. So it's an interesting thing to do that kind of shows instead of tells how much there is to Middle-earth without directly violating any aspect of the story that might have been written down by Tolkien. I guess if they gave the Rings of Power treatment to it, they could have screwed it up, but they didn't. Along with being able to sail on a boat, you would have sailing tests. Tests were secondary types of little mini quests, mini challenges you had to meet throughout the course of the quest. These tests existed even early in the game's life in the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle with, say, escape tests and Gollum. This mechanic would not go away. This cycle, the designers got a lot of experience with that type of mechanic. We're about to see why. I will say, especially from a quest standpoint, the Dream Chaser cycle was the absolute peak of Lord of the Rings, the card game. My favorite quest from the cycle was the
Temple of the Deceived,
where you were actually exploring ruins. So you used cards to create an area where you could actually move from location to location as if you had set up a board. This is something that the game hadn't really done before. Well, it was the game's best attempt at giving you a bit of a board to play with, which is boards are great just for immersion. One complaint people have about thematic card games is that you're just always playing a card game. At least with a board game, you kind of see what's going on a little bit better. Card game, you're doing a lot more with the board in your mind. Because at the Dream Chaser, adding the memorable characters like Naasia and Captain Say here, we're talking about the absolute peak of Lord of the Rings, the card game. As far as player cards, you got the two Noldor heroes out of the Grey Havens. You had Círdan, the shipwright. Círdan, the owner of Narya, the third of the Rings of Power. We now have all 3 Rings of Power, and Narya actually could be attached to Círdan or to Gandalf, as Gandalf actually has that ring in the Lord of the Rings. I have a lot of Noldor allies that were all about discarding cards, card draw, playing cards from your discard pile. That's what the Noldor elves do. You did get bits and pieces of other archetypes. You had some Gondor cards. You had the second version of hero Prince Imrahil, and the second version of hero Denethor, who had Landwyn as one of the first Dale heroes. They would come into play a little bit later. Hero Elfhelm of Rohan, and Argalad, the Sylvan Elf. Now, Assia, the Corsair, was one of those characters that began as an objective ally and then became a hero later in the cycle. She never really got a deck archetype built around her. It's still a cool thing to see thematically. By this point, Rohan decks were heavily utilizing mounts, and Elfhelm leaned into that. As anytime you attached a mount to one of your heroes, if you had Elfhelm, that mount came with additional bonuses. Fits with Rohan, because Rohan, they love their horses. But there was also another notable release in 2016. I'm not even getting to the fact that actually the next cycle technically began in late 2016 instead of early 2017. See, right when the Lord of the Rings card game was reaching its peak with the Dream Chaser cycle, the first true competitor to the Lord of the card game was released. Previously on the Lord of the Rings card game Retrospective.
We heal now as a team.
Right when the Lord of the card game was reaching its peak with the Dream Chaser cycle, the first true competitor to the Lord of the card game was released. And it was another product made by Fantasy Flight Games. That competitor was Arkham Horror, the card game. Another cooperative living card game. This is now the second cooperative living card game to be released. And it was released within the Arkham Horror universe. That's the Lovecraftian universe, which is an open source intellectual property that is used on quite a lot of board games. Board gamers are disproportionately familiar with Lovecraftian horror because it's public IP and I guess anybody could just slap it onto the game. Kind of like Sherlock Holmes. The game shares a lot of DNA with Lord of the card game. For example, every round each player will be drawing an encounter card, just like you do in the Lord of the Rings. You have your heroes, you have resources, you have allies and attachments. You even have a card in the core set called Unexpected Courage. When you play Arkham Horror, the card game, you can tell it was designed 5 years later than the Lord of the Rings, the card game. A lot of aspects of the game are streamlined. I mentioned before that one of the ways the Lord of the Rings card game can get a little finicky is with having very large hand sizes. You have a hand size limit built right into Arkham Horror, the card game. In the Lord of the Rings, you can have a ton of cards in play. In Arkham Horror, you're limited to one ally, one attachment for each of your hands, etc. I mentioned sale tests and hide tests and other forms of tests in the Lord of the Rings the card game. Those have effectively replaced the quest resolution phase. In fact, you could have actually made Arkham Horror the card game, you could have made it a scenario of Lord of the Rings the card game where you skip the quest resolution step every turn and make your different areas connected in ways almost like in the
Temple of the Deceived.
If you're deciding whether or not to get into Lord of the Rings the card game and Arkham Horror the card game, here's what I would go by. If you prefer one theme over the other, try the game with your preferred theme first. If you want a more thematic narrative experience where you're just taking along for the story, Arkham Horror is designed to be like that. Arkham Horror can only be played in campaign mode. It's not the kind of game where you will try to complete a quest 10 times in a row. If you lose in a quest of Arkham Horror the card game, you move on anyway. In that way, Arkham Horror is much more similar to campaign-style board games, while the Lord of the Rings is much more similar to deck construction card games. And if you're saying, wait a second, isn't Arkham Horror also a deck construction style game? It is, but there's a catch. What I just said so far is largely uncontroversial. A lot of people will say Arkham Horror is more thematic, and Lord of the Rings is more gamey of a game. But to say that, I think, is to undersell the point. You see, while there is deck construction in Arkham Horror, the card game, the fact that you can move on in the quest even when you lose, in fact, the first quest in the core set, you can even resign from the quest before it ends. Like, you don't need to win. It completely undermines the motivation for deck construction. In fact, it starts to feel like cheating after a while, or that you're trying too hard. Putting a lot of time to put together an effective Arkham Horror deck to try and make sure you beat a scenario. Part of the fun of it is to lose. Almost feels a little bit like when you jump into a new competitive game with friends and one of your friends chases the meta way harder than everyone else. That's kind of how it feels when someone deck constructs more thoughtfully than everyone else in Arkham Horror. If you're playing it for the story, you don't need to play it to win to the same degree. So if you like the deck construction aspect, Lord of the Rings is the game for you. And that's the majority of the game, and that's where most of the game's depth comes from. But of course, at this time, especially with a lot of board game reviewers, if that's what you're used to, Arkham Horror will be a little bit more similar to that. And as a result, you'll generally see Arkham Horror ranked more highly on board game reviewer lists than you will the Lord of the Rings, the card game. But even with this release, the games are sufficiently different that the Arkham Horror card games release did nothing to precipitate the end of the Lord of the Rings, the card games prime. Around the same time the Arkham Horror card game came out, the Sands of Harad expansion was released. The Sands of Harad and the following Haradrim cycle, of all the expansion cycles in Lord of the Rings, the card game, was the most disappointing to not get a repackaged expansion. After sailing the seas in the Dream Chaser cycle, you land in Umbar, which is part of Harad, which is the desert, almost Africa-like area to the south of Lord of the Rings. If you remember from the Lord of the Rings movies, the Mumaks, the giant Oliphants, they're from Harad, and you see a lot of those in this cycle. Side quests are back in this cycle. Archery is back. You meet objective heroes that become player cards later on in the cycle, in Khalil, Yaza, Jubair, and Firial. But you also see ways that the designers are fine-tuning their mechanics thematically. I mentioned in the Voice of Isengard and Ringmaker cycle the timed mechanic. Well, that's back here for some quests, but it's a temperature mechanic. That is, if it gets too hot, you lose, as opposed to running out of time. Which is the same thing, it's just better. We also have one of the cooler enemy cards here in the Black Serpent, which comes up towards the end of the Haradrim cycle. In terms of player cards, you got a new Gimli and a new Legolas. Gimli and Legolas, who actually work together this time, actually calling each other out.
He was twitching.
He was twitching? Because he's got my axe embedded in his nervous system!
They went very well with 3 Hunter-style decks and anything you may have been trying to do in the Treason of Saruman expansion. You got Khalil, who was, I believe, the only Harad hero. Harad wasn't an archetype that you're able to build full decks around, but you did get a handful of very strong Haradrim allies that you could make at least a good portion of your deck with and use heavily. The Dunedain Ranger Thorindir got bonuses for having completed side quests, which really started to round out the Ranger deck archetype as kind of a bridge between the Dunedain and the Gondor heroes. Hirgan leans a little bit more into traditional Gondorian decks. Fastred built out your Rohan decks. Falco Boffin helps you bring hobbits to the table at a low cost. If you want to use hobbits and you want to avoid using the same 3 or 4 hobbits every time, Falco Boffin's a nice one to roll out there. Falco isn't a strong hero, but allows you to keep your threat very low. And then Quickbeam as a second Ent hero almost got you to the point where you could have a deck where you had 3 Ents as your heroes, which would be kind of cool. The other major contributor to deck building from this cycle was Valor cards. These are cards that you'd see used heavily in the Defenders of Gondor starter deck that got released when the game was relaunched in 2022. Powered your team up if your threat was over 40. If actual areas of Middle-earth had threat levels at any given point, Gondor was almost always over 40. You also had song cards to make song decks a little bit stronger, and even some more Bjornings, which we hadn't seen since the first cycle of the game. It was a great cycle, if made only a little bit bittersweet by the fact that it kind of was the beginning of the decline of the game. Dream Chaser did not feel like the game was starting to peter off. The Haradrim cycle, it kind of felt that way. And it's tough to say why. It could have been that it seemed like Harad was a little bit more of a reach than the other deck archetypes. So we were just coming off cycles where you had Dunedain decks, which fit right into the lore. Noldor, of course, we're going to have Noldor decks. Haradrim decks, okay, don't have as many ideas left. Remember, we don't actually get to know any characters from Harad in the Lord of the Rings movies. Does that mean we're out of the Prime? In fact, the designers still have a few tricks up their sleeve. The Gen Con and Fellowship expansions, now we just had one expansion each year, and it was just relabeled for each convention. In 2016, we had the Siege of Anuminas, and in 2017, the Attack on Dol Guldur. These quests deployed epic multiplayer mode. That's where you could play with more than just 4 players. The Siege of Numenor could be played with up to 12 players in a game, so you had 3 groups of 4 working on quests at the same time. The attack on Dol Guldur took that even to another level, with a very difficult quest, which is infamous for having, I think nobody was able to beat it that played it when it was released at Gen Con in 2017. So if you're able to beat that quest, much less with a group of 8 or more friends, good job. Instead of being one of the expansions that would add to the game from a story angle, such as with the Old Forest and the Fog on the Barrow Downs, these expansions were the testing grounds for mechanics that were used in the Lord of the Rings saga later. The first of the Return of the King boxes actually came out a little bit earlier in 2016 with the Flame of the West. The Flame of the West was the Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli and Gandalf and really everyone else but Frodo and Sam part of the Return of the King. First with the Passing of the Grey Company quest, where you go recruit your army of the dead. Then with the Siege of Gondor and the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Honestly, the main thing I want to highlight for these quests, we know how the story goes, but the artwork on some of these cards, the Witch King card, for example, look at that. You have that floating crown and kind of a little flame thing. That's right out of the books. They did a great job with that. That's actually one area that the movie was a little bit different from the books, is how the Witch King was portrayed in the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Aragorn is, of course, the Fellowship hero for this deck, but you also got a handful of key heroes and key allies. Eowyn gets perhaps the most thematic ability in the history of the game, where once per game, you're able to add 9 to her attack value. By using her and Merry together, you can take out the Witch King just like in Return of the King. This is the second Eowyn card in the history of the game, and it was a good fit. And another option for Baragon with a strong defense number. We also got some big allies such as Prince Imrahil. Prince Imrahil, just to go back to last video here, Prince Imrahil is the ultimate ally card to pair with Caldara, because Prince Imrahil becomes a hero as soon as a hero enters your discard pile. Caldara's ability is to discard her and then bring other strong allies into play. Well, if Prince Imrahil is one of those allies, you've effectively swapped a hero for a hero and gotten an ally for free. The ally version of Halbrad's also key for Dunedain decks because it allows you to control which enemies are engaged with you and not just force yourself to be exposed to open threats. Now we know while the Flame of the West is going on, you have the Mountain of Fire. The Mountain of Fire was released towards the end of 2017, actually in October of 2017. You follow first Frodo and Sam through Mordor with the Tower of Cirith Ungol. Then you have the Black Gate opens and Mount Doom. And with them, the ultimate climax, not only the saga expansion of the Lord of the Rings, but Lord of the Rings, the card game, as a game. If you recall from the Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, Aragorn and the survivors from the victory at Pelennor Fields would attack the Black Gate as a diversion to allow Frodo and Sam to destroy the ring and climb Mount Doom, and to direct Sauron's eye. In this expansion, you run those quests concurrently in epic multiplayer mode, which again already got a test run with the Gen Con and Fellowship quests, Siege of Numenor and Attack on Dol Guldur. And the idea here is those running the Black Gate opens just need to survive long enough to allow Frodo and Sam and Gollum to do their thing and destroy the ring in the Mount Doom quest. It's perfect. It's no better way to end a story. And even look, some of the enemies, like things are cranked up to 11 here. This is the first time in history of the game where you have mechanics that allow enemies with threat costs greater than 50. And even if that's not really what it means, 350 made the enemies just feel stronger to someone who's been playing the game for a while.
What we do is if we need that extra push over the cliff, you know what we do?
Put it up to 11.
11, exactly.
The Mouth of Sauron at 99. Doesn't mean he's the strongest, but that 99 number, you've been playing this game for years, that hits you. You got the 66th threat, Nazgul of Mordor, 56th threat for Gorgoroth Hill Troll. You know, you're in Mordor with these cards. Look at that. Look at the eye. Look at the lidless eye. How cool is that? The Ring Wraith of Sauron, 88. Yeah, you have the chance to earn Gwai here as a boon to come in and save you, just like in the movie. Gollum is now, here he becomes fully a bad guy. The player cards come with the Mountain of Fire are also some of the stronger allies that you'll see. You got Eladon and Elrond here. So Elrond's sons, they come to help you out. Another Éomer hero. You can take enemies out of the staging area in true Rohan fashion. Interestingly, you also got some hobbits, which, if you thought that there was going to be a Scaring of the Shire quest after this, you might have used them, such as Tom Cotton and Rosie Cotton. I literally just connected for the first time now that Rosie and Tom Cotton have the same last name. Wow. So the Flame of the West and the Mountain of Fire, an excellent ending to a saga that deserved one. But the greater saga of the Lord of the Rings, the card game itself, would not end there. And in fact, this was a time when another competitor to the card game would emerge. Now, this competitor wasn't necessarily another card game. This was a rehabilitation, in a way, of the Lord of the Rings card game itself. It was the Lord of the Rings adventure card game, or the Lord of the Rings LCG. It kind of depended, I guess, what it was called, depending on where you looked. Some of these titles of games are a little bit questionable. This was a Steam game that might be a stretch to call it an adaptation of the card game. It was more so an inspired by game, kind of like how some movies are inspired by true events. It was an opportunity for designers to redesign the Lord of the Rings card game, one, in a virtual environment, so you're able to do some things you can't do with the card game, but also streamline areas of the game that they had been dying to streamline for the past 7 years. For example, Caleb Grace, in an interview with Nerd of the Rings, mentioned how they streamlined the resource system in the game, where instead of having each hero have their own resources, the player had resources, and the cards you bought were determined then by the spheres of your heroes. The game was changed in a number of ways like that. Some ways for the better, and some ways for the worse. One of my favorite mechanical changes of the video game compared to the card game is you would have preparation cards, which are like event cards that you play, and then they get triggered later on. This is a really good thing for a video game because you don't have to, the system will remember for you that you played a preparation card. And it also keeps your hand clean, because often that's what you have with a lot of cards in your hand. They're preparations. You're holding onto that card just in case you might have to use it. Now, having played the video game, it is definitely different. I probably would have played a lot more of the game if it were a direct implementation of the card game. For example, the game is set up as a bit more of a battle line type of game. Lord of the Rings card game can feel at times like you have questing characters that are kind of driving the bus, and then fighting characters that are in the back of the bus trying to stab zombies out the window or otherwise, which can be a little bit strange, and you could say not that thematic, but it provides the game with a risk management type decision because you first decide what you have to commit to questing, and then you'll find out whether or not you made a good decision or not. With the battle line type format, where questing has become almost its own version of attacking, where in one of your turns you could choose to attack an enemy, or you could choose to try and make progress on a location that's lined up with the rest of your enemies, it feels very different. It's more tactical and less strategic. There are more obvious wrong decisions that you can make. There's a most efficient way to go about your actions in a given turn. And in the Lord of the Rings card game, even if it's a little bit more complex how you go about each round, the fact that there isn't a defined right answer all the time is a bit of a relief for the players. The game wasn't overly successful, and part of it might have been because, at least when I was playing the game, I didn't feel like I was playing Lord of the Rings, the card game. I felt like I was playing a Lord of the Rings theming of another game, kind of like Keyforge, I guess. I think a direct implementation of the card game might have been more successful, as it would have tapped into the existing player base and becomes a way to play the game without having to use an unofficial card game simulator. In fact, I probably would be playing the game quite a bit if that's what it was, but alas, it isn't. There are also some artwork changes that were a little bit jarring, and I don't know why they changed the artwork for some of the characters. Bilbo, for example, I don't know why they changed it. But while this game wasn't so successful to take the place of the card game, it was one of the signs the prime of the game was beginning to wind down. 2 months before the release of the video game came the Wilds of Rhovanion Deluxe expansion, and the beginning thus of the Arid Mithrin cycle. This would go on to be one of the repackaged expansions, so you already know going in that we're talking about a nice set of cards. So this expansion takes place in the wilder lands to the east of the Misty Mountains. So we're talking Dale and Erebor and Mirkwood and some of the regions that were originally touched on in The Hobbit. And if you liked the story of The Hobbit, this will remind you of the story of The Hobbit. There were Nightmare packs released for the Hobbit Saga expansion. Part of me thinks that the designers wanted another go at the Hobbit storyline, because you kind of had, you had Mirkwood spiders, you had dragons, you had the same region of Middle-earth. Nonetheless, they did a good job with it. The main theme of the player cards of the Arid Mithrin cycle was Dale, and the Kingdom of Dale's thing was attachments, and getting a lot of armor and attachments on allies, actually. Your heroes were Bran, son of Bane, so that's the second Brand hero, and Bard, son of Bran, not to be confused with Bard the Bowman. This is actually now the great-grandson of Bard the Bowman, because you had Bard, and then Bane, then Brand, and then Bard again. And they both, as you can tell, revolve around attachments. Brand gives bonuses for characters with attachments, and Bard helps you keep attachments in play when players get discarded, so as if you're picking up their gear. Well, this was mostly about Dale. You also dipped into 2 newer archetypes. I would call Bjorning to be a new archetype at this point because of how little cards you had early on in the game's history. There was no such thing as a Bjorning deck when you just had the Bjorning Beekeeper and Beorn. We also got the Woodman type, like Haldan here. Like, look, he's, you know, the brawny man here. And we're still talking about attachments. So Haldan actually does better when locations have attachments, which when you have guarded card types, which you had a few of those here, they actually would go into play guarded by a location or sometimes an enemy. That was actually a mechanic that was in the core set, somewhat underutilized throughout most of the game's history, but comes into play here. Like I said, kind of right out of the Hobbit, you also had now a hero Thranduil card to go with your Sylvan Elves, and another version of Dain Ironfoot, Dain who came in at the end of the Hobbit to help win the Battle of Five Armies and become King Under the Mountain. You had another Bilbo, and this Bilbo, interestingly, also kept a threat cost of 9, as strange as that was, that the first Bilbo was the only card with a threat cost greater than the sum of their traits. And Radagast. Radagast, who actually came with Radagast's staff, which was an attachment which fits right into the Dale cycle, but allows you to beef up your creature. Radagast is all about creatures, and as a result, kind of goes well with eagles, too. So if you want to play a lot of giant bears, Radagast is the hero for you. All that is another example of the design getting super smooth here. We had some more eagles get released here, so you have Eagle of the North. And remember that encounter keyword that we had for some of the Gondorian Rangers? Of course that's going to work with eagles, where they just, you know, like Middle-earth eagles, they show up. What better way to show up than show up through the encounter deck like the Eagle of the North? Another interesting release of 2018 was the limited edition 2-player starter set. This starter set was actually quite different from the original starter set and then the revised starter set. It had some of the cards from the original core set and some that you had seen in other areas of the game. So just looking at heroes, for example, you had Aragorn from the core set and Glorfindel from the core set. You also had Bifur and Nori from back when, you know, every other card was a dwarf. We also had the not yet released heroes, Gildor and Glorian and Thorin Stonehelm. So a bit of spoilers for the final cycle of the game.
Stay out of my personal space.
Limited edition starter was more of a collector's item than anything else. Although actually a video on the starter set by Clay Doe, something about that video made me think that I wanted to make YouTube videos myself. So at least I have the starter set to thank for that. I don't know what it was about the video made me think that. It's not a super popular video. He made it look easy. Take with that what you will. The last flavor of print-on-demand expansion we would see is the idea of the customizable quests. So over the last few years here, you saw first the Wizard's Quest in the Woodland Realm, then the Mines of Moria and Escape from Moria. While technically the Mines of Moria and Escape from Khazad-dûm came out in about 2020, I'll still mention them here. If you wanted to be able to play Lawrence card game competitively, this was potentially a chance to do that, where one person could actually be setting up a quest and another player actually trying to play through it. To go back to Lord of the Rings, the card game's video game implementation, that's actually is kind of how it works. They make it so that like Sauron's playing against you. You can also play it yourself by just setting up your own quest and kind of tailoring your own difficulty. If you want more ways to play Lawrence the card game, this is a way to do it. You also got to see some artwork come back from early in the game's history. The Nazgul of Dol Guldur from Escape from Dol Guldur, Ungoliant Spawn, the Watcher is back, Durin's Bane is back. Well, Durin's Bane is back for like the 4th time. It might as well, Durin's Bane might as well have never left. She just made it a hero. It shows up so many times. The final cycle, A Shadow in the East and the Vengeance of Mordor cycle. A Shadow in the East, believe it or not, is not a Game of Thrones book. Those are not coming probably for another 10 years. The new thing with the Shadow in the East and Vengeance of Mordor cycle was enemies with attachments. And this was taking place around the area of Ruin. You know, it's funny. Thematically, this will actually evoke 2022's Rings of Power show. If you look at the enemies here, Thane Ultra kind of like Adar from Rings of Power, someone who's working on behalf of Sauron, the dark scenery, even the prisoners from the Land of Sorrow. It all kind of seems like it could have been made at the same time as the show. I wonder if this was inspired the show in any way, as this came out 3 years before the show was actually released. We're looking at a lot of last hurrahs here. The final quest of this cycle was the Fortress of Nirn, and that is famously one of the most difficult quests in the game. It had been a while since we had seen a truly difficult quest. Maybe this is the hardest one since the Battle of Carn Dûm, but it was meant to be, because it was meant to be the last one that you had to give a run at. The challenge of the Wayne Riders was a bit of a divisive quest. Not because it isn't a good design. It actually may have been the best implementation of racing style designs, as some of the quests throughout his Lord of the Rings involved trying to keep up, whether it be in a ship or otherwise, with some sort of encounter card. Well, the challenge of the Wayne Riders, you're literally been challenged to a race, like a chariot race. Now, I'm not saying that was a jump the shark moment, but it kind of feels like it. Plus, look at that Wayne Rider champion. I can't put my finger on who that looks like. Natalie Dormer, maybe? No, it's the type of thing I think you expect to see in the final cycle of a game. But the game still offered some good additions to Lord of the Rings, the card game, mechanically. The contract cards that you got here were basically challenges on how to build your decks and allowed you to either break rules or get certain benefits if you went against normal deck building tropes. So for example, the Fellowship contract, which is the first of the contracts you got your hands on, had you trying to get 9 unique characters in play, and if you did, you got a nice benefit. That's really cool. It's a great way to add more variety to your game in a way that doesn't feel forced. The heroes of A Shadow in the East are Leadership Frodo and Ned Stark. No, I'm just kidding. And Smeagol, who actually gets his own hero card with the lowest threat cost of any hero in the game at 3. He does not count as a hobbit, though. He is just Gollum. You have the spoiled heroes from the limited edition starter set, Thorin Stonehelm and Gildor Inglorian. You got another Saruman. Lithiriel is a Gondor/Rohan hero that would be featured in the Riders of Rohan starter deck. And then the last hero of the game, surprising almost nobody, was Spirit Aragorn. We had been waiting on Spirit Aragorn for quite some time, as the 3 other Aragorns were released in the first 5 years of the game's existence. So now here in year 9, finally getting the last Aragorn was a fitting end. How funny would it be, though, if they had instead had, say, 3 Frodos in this series, so it was actually Frodo was the one to get a hero for every sphere, and that would have been funny. And improvements to a wide variety of different decks. Sylvan decks got boosts here. Valor decks. Got the legendary Tom Bombadil ally card. Some more attachments to go with some of the Dale cards. You had more Eagles cards. Williador is back. Remember healing Williador in A Journey to Rosgabel in the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle? Good job healing him, even if it took you multiple tries to do it. Good job. Gwaihir was the hero. And one of the cooler cards in the game, Thorongil, which allows you more than one Aragorn. As in, you get to use the card text of 2 different Aragorn cards. Or Frodo, or Prince Imrahil, or any of the other heroes. They got multiple copies throughout the life of the game. You're dealing with the ring a little bit more at the end here. After all, we're talking about Vengeance of Mordor, so we know the ring is going to come into play. So not too much going out on a whimper. It's good cards, but this expansion set did not get a repackage. It was not as popular as Ered Mithrin, or the Dream Chaser, or Angmar Awakened, but it did usher in the end of the prime of Lord of the Rings, the card game. We've covered a lot of ground today, but the story isn't over. In part 6 of our retrospective on Lord of the Rings, the card game, in the final installment of this retrospective, we're going to talk about the end of the game and about the break.
Here we go, pivot! Pivot!
The break that began in 2020 with the release of The Hunt for the Dreadnought and ended with the release of the revised core set in 2022. We're going to talk about not totally unexpected fan-made expansions, which in that gap of releases or after the final release of the game will be the main way you get new content for this game. We'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of fan-made expansions, and we'll also take a look at that last competitor for the game that may have helped usher in the end of the Lord of the Rings, the card game. But until then, I am Jackson Warfield, and I'll see you in the next video.
It is time, Frodo. What does he mean?
In December of 2019, Lord of the Rings, the card game players were treated to the release of the Hunt for the Dreadnought expansion. This expansion took Lord of the Rings, the card game players to the open seas, as they did in the Dream Chaser cycle, and gave them the chance to deploy epic multiplayer mode. This was a great quest and ended up being one of the most expensive purchases I've ever made off of eBay. But the release was bittersweet, as this would be the last of the brand new expansions to be produced for Lord of the Rings, the card game.
Last pages are for you, Sam.
While the Hunt for the Dreadnought marked the end of the main story of the Lord of the Rings, the card game, the world would survive as we began a phase of repackaged expansions for the game. But it wasn't just that. This was an opportunity for fans to come into play and design fan-made expansion content. In today's video, part 6, kind of 7, but part 6 of the Lord of the Rings, the card game's retrospective,
The greatest modern card game.
we're going to talk about the supposed final phase of the Lord of the Rings, the card game's life. The post-credit scenes, where we have the repackaged expansions, fan-made expansions, tools developed over the course of more than a decade of the game's life, and we're going to talk a little bit about the game that arguably replaced the Lord of the Rings the card game in the lives of many living card game players. I'm Jackson Warfield, and please join me as we board the last ship out of the Grey Havens and see what the Undying Lands have in store for us, fans of the Lord of the Rings the card game. 2020 was a busy year for cooperative living card game players. Even aside from the fact that this was a year where, due to a lot of people being kind of locked in their homes, hobby games, card games would be on the rise like almost never before. For the first time in human history that we know of, 3 living card games were being actively produced. The Lord of the Rings the card game was in the midst of the Vengeance of Mordor cycle, which, as we've mentioned, was the last expansion cycle of the Lord of the Rings the card game.
Meanwhile,
the Arkham Horror the card game, the younger brother to the Lord of the Rings the card game, was in the Dream Eaters cycle. This was cycle number 5 for that particular universe. Dream Eaters, I should say, has nothing to do with...
Welcome to the Dreamweavers, young one.
Or... At least, I don't believe they have anything to do with that.
Meanwhile,
there's a new kid on the block. This kid was bitten by a radioactive spider and suddenly was given the powers of streamlined cooperative play. Marvel Champions was released at the end of 2019 and thus saw its initial expansions come in late 2019 and early 2020. Marvel Champions was the newest version of the living card game model, and it was built in large part by designers that had experience with the other living card games. Astute players of games will notice Nate French and Caleb Grace with their names on the Marvel Champions box. Nate French is the original designer of the Lord of the Rings the card game, and Caleb Grace was the lead designer for the majority of the game's maturity. I mentioned before how Arkham Horror the card game shares a lot of DNA with the Lord of the Rings the card game. Like supervillains in a lab, Grace, French, and Michael Boggs modified that DNA to create the monster that is Marvel Champions. Marvel Champions is the most streamlined example of the Fantasy Flight cooperative living card game system. That is, if you want to play a cooperative card game with a 50-ish card deck, Marvel Champions is the fastest way to get that game played. The way Marvel Champions works, all players are one hero, and their deck of cards are different support items and allies for that hero. Each scenario is a different bad guy, a different boss, and each cooperative game of Marvel Champions is effectively a boss battle, albeit a boss battle that plays out where sometimes you're fighting and sometimes you're scheming. Here are some ways that the games compare. With Lord of the Rings the card game, first you have a quest phase, and then you have a combat phase. And a big aspect of how the game plays is making decisions on how much to commit to quests without knowing what you're truly going to need in the combat phase, making judgment calls like that and trying to manage your risk. Arkham Horror the card game instead replacing the quest phase with skill tests where you will try to make progress on objectives as you are going from card to card like locations. So it's a bit more thematic, although also a little bit more tactical. But it's not too different. You could make Lord of the Rings the card game scenarios to play kind of like Arkham Horror the card game if you so chose. Marvel Champions keeps a lot of that but simplifies it even more. In Marvel Champions, in each round of play, you're going to be declaring whether or not it is a round for scheming or a round for combat. You don't have to do both in every round. The way you do this is by flipping your hero from hero form to alter ego form. In alter ego form, it's all about scheming. In hero form, it's all about fighting. This decision serves to streamline the game because you have less to consider in a given turn. The turns play faster. There's less going on. As a result, the decisions are, as part of being streamlined, the decisions you're making are a little bit simpler. The way you manage risk between progress in the overall boss battle through scheming versus combat and dealing with your immediate problems is in the decision of whether to go alter ego or hero. And once you make that decision, it becomes more clear what you need to do in a given turn. In Lord of the Rings the card game, and to a certain extent in Arkham Horror the card game, you're keeping both plates in the air at the same time. So the risk management decisions are more persistent and continuous.
Schemes and plots are the same thing.
As a result, the game is a little bit more complex, but arguably deeper at the same time. Marvel Champions also streamlines other corners of the game. For example, resource tokens are gone. Instead, you discard cards as resources. Now, this obviously reduces the number of components you have in the game, and for some people that enjoy this type of mechanic, it will feel like a natural fit. And actually, with Marvel Champions, it works fairly well because you draw back up to a hand size every turn, so it's less of a challenge deciding what you want to discard, because some cards you'd want to discard them anyway, so you may as well use them for resources. It can lead to a little bit of analysis paralysis when you have to decide whether or not to play a card or whether or not to use it as a resource. This is where some people have issues with games like Race for the Galaxy, where your resources are cards, which is kind of what the Marvel Champions has done here and what Arkham Horror does to an extent as well. I actually prefer this separation of resource tokens from cards that you get in Lord of the Rings, the card game. I don't think that particular tweak on the rules that Marvel Champions has deployed is a streamlining, but that might just because of the way my brain works. With the Lord of the Rings, the card game's print run ending, players had the options to potentially jump into Arkham Horror, the card game, and now they had the option to jump into Marvel Champions. If a player wanted thematic experiences similar to dungeon crawling board games, Arkham Horror, the card game, is going to give more of that feel. If players were more interested in getting quick games together, Marvel Champions is a natural fit. The deck construction aspects of Marvel Champions are streamlined. You get your heroes, you make a few adjustments to your deck, and everyone has nemesis and weakness cards you kind of shuffle in. You don't have a ton of deck construction options, and that's by design so you can get the games played quickly. Marvel Champions also, by virtue of being only boss battles, is less immersive, provides less of a narrative experience than even Lord of the Rings, the card game, does. The fact that all the games are boss battles meant it felt a little bit flat for me. It feels like I could have been playing through things that happened in between fighting the big bads. But I'm not going to deny the fact that Marvel Champions is very clean. And there's an appeal to Marvel Champions that Lord of the Rings, the card game, doesn't have. There's something to be said for having hero packs, tightly themed around one hero. If you're walking through the aisles of a game store and you see a box of cards for Captain America, and then you see one for Thor, and then Hulk, you pick your favorite, all your friends pick your favorites, you go home, you play them. There's something to be said about that appeal. You don't get that appeal with the Lord of the Rings, the card game. It's not as tidy of a package. Lord of the Rings, the card game, your team is more cobbled together. It's a ragtag team of misfits. You're going to have some hobbits with some rangers, with some elves that we're maybe not even totally sure why they're there. Sacrificed deck construction elements that make the Lord of the Rings, the card game a deep and rewarding experience to get into, and replace them with tight branding that hits your spinal cord in a way that makes you just want to buy it. If you're playing Lord of the Rings, the card game, because you wanted to do deck construction, but you didn't want to get into Magic the Gathering or Pokemon the trading card game, that was kind of lost until a third option emerged, which it would, not too long after the end of the Lord of the Rings card game's official release cycles. In the same month that The Hunt for the Dreadnought was released, another announcement was made by Fantasy Flight Games that rocked the living card game community. The Fantasy Flight Games forums were shutting down. Now, this might not have been a big deal for many games, but this was a big deal for Lord of the Rings, the card game, especially. The Fantasy Flight forums were the place to go for rules clarifications. And when you're dealing with a game that has, at this point, 9 years of expansions, you're going to need some rules clarifications. Not only was the game ending, but the forums were going away. This was a sky's falling situation for Lord of the Rings, the card game fans. So people were trying to find ways to capture all of the knowledge of the last 9 years. And a lot of the rules clarifications that were offered by designers like Caleb Grace, they went right into the forum. At this point, there wasn't a errata or a rules clarification to be officially released for the game in a couple years. Now, the community has survived through this, and most of these rules clarifications have either reappeared on Board Game Geek or otherwise findable somewhere on the internet. There actually is a website, too. The FFG Forum Archive is there if you really need to find something from the past. But I will say that the mood at the time was that things seemed to be ending. Players needed a bit of a life raft. They need something to look forward to here, because players have been playing this game for years, and not a lot of people want to live through the day when the courage of men failed. So who came to save the day? Well, many of the content creators for the community came together to produce something that was not entirely unexpected. In March of 2021, we saw the beginning of A Long Extended Party. Not to be confused with A Long Expected Party from the Lord of the Rings story. A Long Extended Party was the most fleshed out fan expansion of the Lord of the Rings, the card game to date. Fan-made expansions were not new in 2021 for the Lord of the Rings, the card game. Early in the game's history, you had for example, Ninja Dorg scenarios, which were quest cards put out for the core set. One of the biggest criticisms of the original Lord of the Rings card game core set was that it was too difficult. Ninja Dorg, who I think went on to actually do some legit game design down the road, Ninja Dorg produced scenarios that were easier than some of the ones in the core set, gave you something else to do with those cards, and also used some of the unique characters that had no part to play in the original story. In 2014, Ian R. Martin of Tales from the Cards created the fan-made expansions The First Age, where if you've read the Silmarillion, playing the First Age expansions feels a little bit like playing a card game where you can have a hero that's like, you know, Jesus or Moses or Muhammad. It's like there's something untouchable about the First Age lore that gets firmly touched in this expansion. Well done, though. Stories of the First Age are some of Tolkien's best works, and some of the characters, despite having no dialogue in the Silmarillion, are very memorable. Probably my favorite hero of this fan-made set is Fingolfin, which I think is how it's pronounced. I don't think it's Fingolfin. But Fingolfin is an excellent defender. That 4 defense and 6 health is pretty strong, and that fits the lore because Fingolfin was known for battling Morgoth in single combat. You also had the Mastery Sphere, which is all about corruption. You see Feanor in there. Tell you what, the quality of the First Age really shows what fans can do. Eventually, Mark Lammer, the creator of Vision of the Palantir, would create the Legacy of Feanor series of expansions and get the unique ally out there, Fatty Lumpkin. These scenarios are very well done, but the crown jewel of fan-made expansions was a long extended party. Now, people have mixed opinions on fan-made expansions.
It's just beyond this door.
What is?
My playroom.
Like your Xbox and stuff?
Most players of games tend to not continue on and find the fan-made expansions. And there are a number of reasons for this. 1, without a publisher for a game, the products themselves can be difficult to get. 2, without a publisher name backing a product, even sometimes with a publisher name backing a product, changing who's making the product means that it's a bit of an unknown in terms of quality. There's at least an illusion of deep play testing going on when you have a game that has the same publisher name against every expansion. So if you go to a fan-made expansion, the image of a bunch of guys like you in a garage coming up with scenarios, it's understandable to not want to spend a ton of time or money to get your hands on that, thinking that it would be a disappointment. Now, those tendencies aren't always fair, because if you look at the actual quality of this product and fan-made expansions for other games, it is very often at or even sometimes above the original product. The second most frequently featured game on my channel is Heroescape, and Heroescape is a miniatures game that ended its publishing run in 2011 and went into fan-made expansion territory and stayed there for over a decade. The fan-made expansions for Heroescape, the card mechanisms got more advanced, even while you were trying to pick up the miniatures by virtue of buying miniatures from other games and kind of mashing it all together. In physical terms, sloppy, but mechanically was actually very tight. When Heroescape came back, those that had gotten into the fan-made expansions were not exactly happy to see its return. After all, the game had evolved into something new. This new officially published version of the game wasn't going to fit in perfectly with that anymore. The Heroescape community had taken a bit of a turn. But Heroescape went 13 years between print runs. Lord of the Rings, the card game, only had to go 2 years before repackaged expansions came out. And it wasn't new stuff anyway, so we already knew it was all going to work. So it was a welcome addition to see some of these repackaged expansions and see them released. From a mechanism standpoint, went beyond anything that the original published game would go to. And the sky's the limit when you're talking about fan-made expansions. You can work anything into the game that you'd like. And when you're looking at fan-made expansions for the Lord of the Rings card game, characters that never made it into the original game that in theory could have gone in there are getting inserted. For example, in a long extended party, some of the cards you'll see are Goldberry, Tom Bombadil's wife, and the Blue Wizards, 2 of the 5 Istari, that is the wizards that came to Middle-earth. So you had Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast. We all know them. Most people don't know Alatar and Palando. They're left as a big unknown in Tolkien's lore to say they were helpful in the East. We don't know how, and that mystery is actually part of what makes Middle-earth an interesting location, is mysteries like that where we don't have everything fully explained to us. But if you want to play with them, this is the time to do it. Maybe there'll be a TV show or video game at some point that invokes Alatar and Palando, the Blue Wizards. But if you don't want to wait years or decades for that to happen, a fan-made expansion for a well-established card game is a great place to do that. If you want to get any of the fan-made content for the Lord of the Rings card game, now is your time, because one of the superhero of the Lord of the Rings card game, Doug Beer, has produced an MB print order that I will link to in this description, where if you're watching this video by the end of June 2025, you can get in on a discount deal to get the fan-made expansions more clearly than it probably will be in the future. Now, despite everything I'm saying in support of fan-made expansions, I'm going to be honest, I don't plan to play the fan-made expansions, at the very least with the level of vigor that I played the Fantasy Flight Games official published expansions. And I have spent some time wondering why that is. Imagining, like, am I just brainwashed by commercialism?
And this is what you think brings happy?
I don't think it's that simple. I think in a similar way to the appeal of Marvel Champions, in that it's presented in that nice clean package, and you can buy, say, the Captain America pack, and you know this is the Captain America pack, and you feel like you have the Captain America pack. That aspect of the Lord of the card game, to say, oh, it's a Fantasy Flight Games product, here's a new official expansion, this is going to fit into my existing collection, the cards are going to match. There's a human instinct, I think, to collect things, especially for, a lot of, middle-aged men like me. In fan-made expansions, it breaks away from the core product in ways that, while awesome, I'm glad it exists, you can only play so much of a game in your life. I guess what I'm saying is similar to how Fantasy Flight Games and the designers of the game thought that the game was a complete game. There's something nice about having a complete game now in my collection. My time in Middle-earth is more as a human, as opposed to an immortal elf. But while anyone would have expected that the game eventually would stop getting new expansions, and those making fan-made expansions were ready to go as soon as this publishing run ended, what was not expected, that this really wasn't the end. In fact, the game was coming back. Before the game came back, however, there was another Fantasy Flight game that was released within the Lord of the Rings universe. And for anybody that thought that a game on cards wasn't as immersive as a game could be, this game wasn't just in cards. It was also on a board, and also in an app. In 2019, Fantasy Flight Games released Lord of the Rings Journeys in Middle-earth, inspired in two ways. One, it obviously takes place in Middle-earth, like the Lord of the Rings card game does. Two, it was also inspired by the Arkham Horror-themed board game, Mansions of Madness. So unlike with the card game, where the Lord of the Rings game came first and then the Cthulhu game came later, here we had the Cthulhu game coming first, and then the Lord of the Rings version coming after the fact. Now, given the release of the game being in 2019, I would imagine a lot of people at Fantasy Flight Games thought that people would be jumping from the Lord of the Rings card game into the new expandable Lord of the Rings game of Journeys in Middle-earth. While that may have been the plan for a while, Journeys in Middle-earth did not have the staying power that Lord of the card game did. If you play the game, you'll actually notice a lot of the artwork is been reused, and a lot of the heroes that you get in Journeys in Middle-earth, the characters you actually play with, are kind of the same ones you get in the core set of Lord of the Rings card game, including the non-canonical ones that have now been around since Middle-earth Quest in 2009, namely Eleanor and Barivor. Journeys in Middle-earth also required an app to play, which is something that board gamers are always suspicious of, to be honest. But the game would only end up getting 8 expansions. Of these 8 expansions, 2 of them were legit expansions, Spreading War and Shadowed Paths. You had 3 figure packs, Villains of Eriador, Dwellers in Darkness, and Scourges of Wastes. You also had 3 digital expansions where you use the content you already had. Really, you could say the game only had 2 expansions. It just didn't take off the way the Lord of the card game did. If that was your getting off point for the game, it left you ready to get back into the game in about 2022. Before the game was re-released, there was a hint that it might have been re-released as something entirely different. There's this magazine company called Hatchet, and there are a couple issues in the United Kingdom release for the Lord of the Rings card game magazine. If you can imagine playing the Lord of the card game as a magazine subscription where within the magazine itself are the scenarios you play, and the cards that just come with issues of the magazine, that was going to be a thing, it looks like, for a bit. At least some issues were put out in the UK. Now, I don't know if there's something about British people and magazines. The only other instance I'm familiar with where you have a magazine-like subscription for a big tabletop game is Warhammer. Games Workshop being a British company, you end up getting like $1,000 worth of Warhammer miniature sprues and stuff where you're paying like $10 a month for a while. They had 5 issues of this. It was an interesting idea. I guess it wasn't impossible that this would have been the new version of Lord of the card game as opposed to the repackaged cycles, but it seems like it was a bit of a test product that was eschewed in favor of repackaged expansions. Purchased is one-off things. Kind of happy they didn't go in the magazine route, because finding missing magazines would probably be tough. I can't see game stores stocking like 20 different issues of a magazine unless it was a very targeted shop. It seemed like it would be a big thing where you're chasing things on eBay for a while if you didn't get the initial subscription. I can understand not going in that direction, but it's fun to think about.
We must be quick.
The revised core set for the Lord of the Rings The Card Game was released in 2022. The revised core set would fix some of the problems of the initial core set. For example, the fact that you had to buy 2 core sets to play with 4 threat counters. And it would provide extra cards on some of the cards that for some reason you only got 1 of in the original core set. Like, that was kind of dumb. 1 Dwarven Tomb. It was kind of silly. The game would also add a campaign mode. You would also get, only a month later, the Dark of Mirkwood expansion, which extended the core set's 3-quest campaign into a 5-quest campaign. All the lessons that had been learned through the release of Arkham Horror, the card game, through Marvel Champions, and through the various Lord of the Rings expansions over the years have now been incorporated back into the core set. Assuming you're watching this video somewhat close to when it was released in 2025, that version of the core set is on shelves today. Let's be real, it's the same game, and it's not a new edition. It's a revised set. So whereas the core set was the taco, this is the Crunchwrap Supreme. All the tortillas, cheeses, meats, and vegetables from 2011 through 2020 were about to get repackaged like a giant burrito at Chipotle and given back to you again, which sounds less appealing when I put it that way. You also now have starter decks, and at this point you only have 4 starter decks. Maybe one day we'll get more starter decks, but you have 4 starter decks that will help kickstart your deck construction experience. You have the Defenders of Gondor, the Dwarves of Durin, the Elves of Lorien, and the Riders of Rohan. These decks are not self-contained decks the way Marvel Champions hero packs are. Rather, they are decks you could play by themselves, but they're really meant to just be more tools to build decks with the cards you have in the core set and with any other sets that you might happen to have. These decks are nudging you in the direction of what to play, but they're not telling you what to play. And I think the fact that these starter decks are not named after one hero and are instead named after groups of characters tells you what really is different between Marvel Champions and the Lord of the Rings The Card Game. I think Marvel Champions is a good game, but for me personally, Marvel games are never going to measure up to Middle-earth games. There's something about the mortal hero leading the way that is much more enticing to me for a story, and for a game for that matter. Part of the whole point of Lord of the Rings is that Frodo, who would be no more than a child to your eyes, is arguably the #1 hero for all of Middle-earth. Someone who's 4 feet tall and is the opposite of a superhero. I'm much more interested in Frodo's story as a regular short dude who's never going to leave the Shire being asked to then save the world than I am someone who was bitten by a radioactive spider, has now great powers, and has the ability to save the world, and now just has to not waste their power. I don't know if you've noticed, but I have not been bitten by a radioactive spider. Most likely, you have not been bitten by a spider either. I think that the immortal hero story has some appeal, especially for those that have lived long enough to know that for a fact, you're not going to be bitten by a radioactive spider. You're almost certainly not going to inherit Brewster's millions. If you're going to make a difference in the world, it's going to be the hard way. So I like stories and I like games that feed into that trope. To be fair, there are some characters in Lord of the Rings that are like superheroes. Gandalf is like a superhero, but he's a support character. Aragorn is kind of a superhuman, but he's matching up against Sauron, who is more than even a demigod. He's basically a god. That battle between Aragorn and that big troll at the Battle of the Black Gate in Return of the King, they originally filmed that with him battling Sauron, if I remember the special features from the DVDs properly. But that's part of why I find the Lord of the Rings The Card Game so appealing, and why I don't see myself ever fully moving off into a game like Marvel Champions. After the revised core set and the Dark of Mirkwood expansion pack and all the starter decks, we now saw the releases of the repackaged content. This was the re-releasing of the greatest hits of the game. So we're talking the older band members touring the world, just playing the hits. That's a real phase that rock bands go through, and it's a worthwhile phase for this game. We've officially entered the second generation of the same game, where you have the same content you saw in the first decade, now being repackaged in a way that makes it more fun. The game is also set up to make it easier to get into the game. For one, the idea of expansions is done with. You're no longer going to have expansions for the game that you might see for $5 on clearance at Miniature Market, because you can't play it anyway if you were to buy it, because the expansion you need to play that expansion is no longer available. That's no longer a thing. The 3 expansion cycles that earned the repackaging treatment and the new campaign treatment were Angmar Awakened, the Dream Chaser, and Arid Mithrin. I've talked about this a little bit early in the series, but these were the best expansion cycles in the game. Angmar Awakened, arguably the best player cards. Dream Chaser, arguably the best campaign. Arid Mithrin, arguably the best combination of both. I would have loved to see a Haradrim repackaged expansion, but I can understand drawing the line here. These expansions were then re-released in separate hero expansions and campaign expansions. So if you just needed more player cards, you get the hero expansion. You just need the quests, you get the campaign expansion. No longer are the games being released and you kind of have to buy things where you only want 20% of what you're buying. You also had the re-releases of the Lord of the Rings saga, the high point of the game. And playing through the Lord of the Rings saga is a high point in tabletop Playing through the Lord of the Rings saga in the Lords of Card game is one of the high points as a tabletop gamer, period. If you played this game and you haven't attempted to go through the saga campaigns, and well, really it's one saga campaign for Lord of the Rings, I recommend it highly. In fact, that's a potential angle that we could take the channel in, is I could do playthroughs on those quests. The Arid Mithrin and Return of the King repackaged expansions were released at the end of 2024, around when I began this video series. And it seems like this is the end of the official Fantasy Flight Games releases for the game. Seems. There is an article released on Fantasy Flight Games' website on February 7th of 2025. The article is Designer Journal, Introducing Current and Legacy Environments. The idea being that old enough cards are basically too hard to keep balanced, and they're no longer going to be like in rotation. This is something that trading card game players will be familiar with, because when a trading card game gets past a certain point, you get too many cards that there are just going to be too many loopholes in how to play the game, and the game will inevitably break. What's interesting about this is that this article wasn't just about Marvel Champions and Arkham Horror the card game. They mentioned Lord of the Rings the card game. They have a picture of it right in the article. No one has ever said more expansions are coming for Lord of the Rings card game. In fact, they've pretty heavily implied that they were ending it. But the fact that it's been added here makes me wonder, and makes a lot of people wonder too. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't make everyone wonder. Some people are just saying, no, this is it. And this could just be, if you're going to have a Lord of the Rings card game event, and it's going to be a competitive event to see who can accomplish quests most effectively, that you can't play with cards that weren't part of the repackaged content beginning in 2022. That might be all this is. But I don't think it's an accident that the door has been left open just a crack, because why not? They don't need to kill the Lords of the Card game. And I've actually seen now in 2025, I've seen more of this game on the shelves than I ever have before. If you didn't get into the game in the first 10 years of the game, you didn't need to. Like, it can be new for you now. It's well designed. There's a lot to do. Why do they have to say the game is canceled? They don't need to. They could, in fact, that probably would be bad for sales. They could, down the road, decide to release more packs. Maybe they could release more starter decks. It's very possible they release more starter decks. They could release individual scenarios that are just streamlined versions of previous ones. For example, take the Nightmare version of Conflict at the Carrack and make that its own quest. Maybe they take the Battle of Lake Town, where you battle Smaug, or any of the battles with Durin's Bane, and have them almost in Marvel Champions style boss battle one-off encounters. They can make it part of the campaign, or they could choose not to. In fact, there are a lot of bosses to choose from in Lord of the Rings card game. Watcher in the Water, Saruman, the Witch King, any of the ones that Fantasy Flight Games kind of invented within the Middle-earth lore. Things could be on the horizon for the game. I hope they are, and I also hope that they reprint Hunt for the Dreadnought for anyone that still wants to buy that, because that was pretty expensive to get. But all that being said, if you want to keep playing the game and you even can't get your hands on some of the materials, there is more out there for you. Before I finish the series, I definitely want to mention Dragon Cards. Dragon Cards is a web interface where you can actually play the Lord of the Card game. It was developed by C-Stan, who has developed many things, including RingsDB for Lord of the Card game, that make the game actually more fun to play. Dragon Cards has effectively replaced Octagon as the best virtual card game implementation of Lord of the Card game. Better than anything you might end up seeing on Tabletop Simulator. And it's actually the game, as opposed to the Lord of the Rings, the card game, or adventure card game video game, which is not really the game. This is the game in digital format.
Dear Sam, you cannot always be torn in two. You will have to be one and whole for many years.
I want to be
You
sure
have so
to
much
thank
to
anyone
enjoy
who had a
and to
hand in
be
the creation of this game, especially designers Nate French and Caleb Grace. Thank you very much for making this game. And thank you to all the playtesters and the unnamed playtesters, and there are other designers to help with different expansions and the Nightmare expansions and all the artists. A lot of people had to do with building of this game. Obviously, I've made a multiple hour video series on this. It's impacted my life and it's impacted the lives of many. Thank you. I believe I've made my case for why the Lord of the Rings, the card game, is the greatest modern card game. What do you see on the horizon? Why do the white gulls call across